Well, hello everybody and welcome to the Drydock episode 360 part 2, of course, Patreon Drydock, so lots of questions, let's begin. GDFX asks, if the Royal Navy hadn't exchanged 3rd Battlecruiser Squadron and 5th Battle Squadron, what would some likely effects be at Jutland? I think the overall effects to the Royal Navy would be fairly negative, and there's a few fairly easy reasons to point to. Firstly, 3rd Battlecruiser Squadron, ignoring everything else, is 3 ships, whereas 5th Battle Squadron is 4. But then you also go into the type of ships. 3rd Battlecruiser Squadron is the Invincibles. 5th Battle Squadron is the Queen Elizabeths. And that means we're talking about ships that, on paper, are a fraction faster than the QEs, but given that they are considerably older vessels by the time of Jutland, they're probably similar speed, if not potentially actually mildly slower. They obviously don't have anywhere near the armour protection. I mean, okay, they've got better protection than New Zealand and Indefatigable, but I suspect my roll of unused tinfoil has better protection than Indefatigable. In any case, firepower-wise as well, they have the same number of guns as the QEs, 8, but they can't bring all of them to bear on a broadside except on very, very narrow arcs. So effectively they've got 6, and of course they're 12-inch guns, not 15-inch guns, and they also don't have the latest in fire control systems, which of course the QEs do. So less capable ships, and there's one less of them. And of course the one saving grace of 3rd Battlecruiser Squadron at Jutland is that because it's been up to Scapa Flow, and they've been under the control of Admiral Jellicoe for a while, their gunnery is very good, which is why Invincible manages to essentially kill Lutzow before the reverse happens in a rather more dramatic fashion. If 5th Battle Squadron and 3rd Battlecruiser Squadron never switch places, then that gunnery training isn't going to happen, so we would have to assume that the Battlecruiser Squadron's gunnery is going to be approximately the same as the rest of the Battlecruiser fleet. So, which means that if everything goes as it historically does, then Beatty's getting beaten up, and then at roughly the same time, or maybe a fraction later, 3rd Battlecruiser Squadron shows up to try and help, but instead of tight groups of very powerful 15-inch shells, you're going to get somewhat more desultory fire from fewer 12-inch guns, which, while it redresses the numbers balance somewhat, the Germans aren't going to look around and go, oh no, we should probably run away from this, because they were perfectly happy to engage when the odds were 6-1. Now, thanks to the loss of Queen Mary and Indefatigable, the odds have been reset to 7-1, which is one more, but with Queen Mary not there, having her 13.5-inch guns, and with Lion quite badly damaged, you could probably argue that the odds have essentially just been reset to what they were at the beginning of the run to the south. Now, admittedly, the German ships have taken some damage, but I think they'd be far more willing to stick it out. And obviously, the Invincibles are far more vulnerable than the Queen Elizabeth, so potentially you could see one or more badly damaged or lost in any case. There are only 2 real bright spots potentially for this scenario. One is that Admiral Hood may well be much better versed in how BT operates than Evan Thomas was, and therefore 3rd Battlecruiser Squadron might not be left behind the way that 5th Battle Squadron was, and in that case, well, the engagement then starts with 9 British battlecruisers against the Germans, and I mean, it's probably still not going to save Indefatigable, but the sheer weight of fire and the number of British ships means that probably all the German ships should be taken under fire. And at least some British ships are, like Der Flinger historically, going to have essentially training gunfire because they're not being shot at. And so if that happens, that might dissuade the Germans a little bit. The other thing is that if we assume that doesn't happen, or it still leads to roughly similar historical results, and we end up with a run to the north, then if we assume that 5th Battle Squadron takes the place of 3rd Battlecruiser Squadron when they intercept the first scouting group, well, a bunch of 15-inch shells at short range are going to mess up Lutzow even more than Invincible's 12-inch shells historically did, and probably mess up a bunch of other German battlecruisers as well. And of course, the Queen Elizabeths are far less vulnerable to return fire, so you're probably not going to get an Invincible-style catastrophic explosion. So potentially you might end up with actually First Scouting Group at that point taking far more damage than historical, and thus the losses evening up in terms of battle cruisers lost. But of course, if you've got a full-on battleship squadron as opposed to a battlecruiser squadron, it's entirely possible Jellicoe might have 5th Battle Squadron already placed within his general line of battle, and they might not be in a position to make that intercept anyway, at which point it'll become a case of, well, where exactly is 5th Battle Squadron and how many 15-inch shells can they fling at the Kaisers and the Koenigs? Warren Jervey asks, if France had won the Franco-Prussian War and German unification for some reason didn't occur, what impact would this have had on naval development during the last part of the 19th century and the first decades of the 20th? Is it likely that some other power might have engaged in a naval arms race with Great Britain? And if so, who would that be? It is a very interesting scenario to think about. One of the things you've got to bear in mind, if we assume that either Germany remains as individual states or perhaps a bunch of confederations, maybe 2 or 3, so we're not looking at the full German state that we understand it these days, yeah, they're not going to have the industry or finances individually to build anything like the High Seas Fleet, so we can essentially ignore that. This does make a few interesting changes to the timeline, though, because historically, the rise of a unified Germany and its threat to become a European hegemon was exactly why you ended up with France and Russia going from being essentially on again, off again hatred and enemies of the UK for most of the 19th century, except when it was time for France and Britain to beat up on Russia in the Crimean War. It then all obviously switched over to, we're all going to be friends in the Triple Entente to deal with Germany. Well, if Germany doesn't exist and you don't need a Triple Entente to deal with a rising power in the middle of Europe, you don't need to be friends with people you've never really gotten on with before, which means that Russia and France will continue to be fairly hostile to the UK and vice versa. So at that point, you could probably look at the 1870s and 1880s as at least some guidance as to how everybody's going to be staring daggers at each other. Now, would there have been a naval arms race? In some degree, yes, there would have been, because the naval arms race really kicks off in the 1890s when Britain starts building pre-dreadnoughts in job lots. It transitions into the Anglo-German naval arms race, especially once you get to the dreadnought period. But in the 1890s and early 1900s, it's more a general Britain versus everybody else building race as it is, it's not specifically building against Germany. Now, honestly, I don't think the Russians are really going to change all that much. They are really pushing the limits of what they can do with the hilariously collapsing Russian monarchical system that they've got going there. And you're probably still going to see the Russo-Japanese War, because that's not really influenced by the existence of Germany. France is another matter, because if France doesn't have to spend quite as much money on the army because they don't have big unified Germany on their borders, they could divert a bit more funding to their navy. Now, they do have a fair bit of catch-up to do infrastructure-wise, and that isn't really going to change. But potentially, if they win the Franco-Prussian War and their economy doesn't take the hit that it historically does afterwards, and maybe they win the Franco-Prussian War because the Marine Nationale is slightly better prepared, or at least has a significant role to play in it, maybe they catch the Prussian fleet out in open waters and manage to fight them, then it's possible that the Génicole might not settle in quite as much in the Marine Nationale in subsequent years. So they might not actually be playing infrastructure catch-up quite so much. Now, economics is another factor. France is falling behind Britain or the British Empire economically, but I think you might see a not a Marine Nationale that steps in and takes the place of the High Seas Fleet in terms of just sheer scale of construction, but certainly a much stronger Marine Nationale against which the British are competing primarily. And of course, this also means they're probably going to be maintaining the full 2-power standard, as opposed to the 60% larger than Germany that they historically kind of shuffled into place. And of course, none of this affects the rise of the United States, so they're almost certainly going to be building roughly the same number of pre-dreadnoughts as they did historically. So that's going to have to be factored in. And I have a feeling that by the early mid-1900s, you're probably going to be looking at a situation where, especially with light of the Russo-Japanese War, the British 2-power standard is going to be the US fleet and the Marine Nationale, in whichever order, rather than the Russian fleet. So, yeah, there's still going to be a naval arms race. Fisher's still going to want Dreadnought. And, well, it'll be interesting to see how the US and France react to that. The other thing which might be quite an interesting factor in the absence of United Germany is what happens with Italy. Because, of course, Austria-Hungary, without the backing of Germany, is in a bit more of a precarious position. And, well, Italy and Austria-Hungary never got on well anyway, so they're not going to ally with each other. But if the Marine Nationale is being a little bit more assertive, building a few more ships, then you could see both the British and the French trying to court the Italians to bring them into their sphere of influence, because although the Italian Navy is smaller than either of them, it could be a bit of a balance tipper in the Mediterranean, because of course the French can concentrate a fairly large force in Toulon, and because they're not going to really be worried about a British invasion of northern France. And the British, although they will have a larger navy overall, obviously in the Mediterranean, that's restricted somewhat to the Mediterranean fleet, at which point, if the British can get the Italians on side, well, theoretically that adds the Italian navy potentially to a British battle line, and of course secures any threat to Malta. Whereas if the French get the Italians on side, then potentially they have local superiority in the Med, and at that point Italy threatens Malta. So I think there's going to be a lot of negotiation in that area. Fool in a Hat asks, please tell us you won't use AI to produce your videos. Perhaps not never, but at least for the foreseeable future. It would be very disheartening to see another YouTube channel fall to that. I can assure you that AI is not, has never been, and will never be any significant part of this channel. Apart from anything, very occasionally I'll ask ChatGPT or some of the other AIs some naval-related question for giggles, basically. And it's hilarious to see, 3 different AI or LLMs, whatever you want to call them, give you 3 completely different answers, all of which are equally wrong. Yeah. And the other fun thing is, of course, if you ask the same question in subtly different ways, you're asking basically the same thing, you're just changing the language, the same AI will give you different answers, again, mutually contradictory. It's not a reliable thing for, any kind of accurate history, anything other than the absolute highest level, like, who won the Battle of Trafalgar? And even then, I wouldn't necessarily trust it. The only regular part of the channel that isn't done by me is the thumbnails, which Mrs. Drac does, because she's better at graphic design than I am. Outside of that, there are occasional guest contributors and so forth, especially in the field of 3D animation. But day in, day out, what you see is what you get from me, Drac, sitting behind my computer and going to archives and so on and so forth. Now, with that said, given that you asked the question, and in the interest of full transparency, I do make a minimal use of AI in 3 areas. Firstly, I have trained a artificial AI voice package on something like 50 hours of my videos, and I don't use that day to day. I did use it partially in the first Hungarian flotilla video, simply because the time differences between making a long statement in Hungarian and making that same statement in English were so variable that once I'd got it translated, I thought it would probably be better to plug that translation into the voice model AI, and because then I can regulate how fast or slow it speaks, and thus kind of vaguely fit it to obviously the sub vocalization on the video, which is in Hungarian. That is the only time I've actually debuted that AI version of me, and I don't intend to use that in the future. The only reason it exists at all is essentially just in case something really, really horrible happens to me that makes me unable to speak, but somehow able to do everything else, at which point, I've kind of, I've put it in the bank as a potential way of addressing a potential failure of my voice at some point in the future. But that's more of a break glass in case of emergency, and I don't even know if it's a particularly good idea. It was just something I did at the time. Other than that, the other two areas where you might see a small modicum of AI influence is, firstly, very, very, very rarely there'll be a concept that's being described in a video that doesn't have any pictures to go with it. Basically because, it's almost certainly going to be an absurd concept, one of my little sarcastic bits, that therefore obviously there isn't going to be a picture of. And no, that doesn't mean I'm going to use AI to generate pictures of historical events where there aren't pictures of them, because I think that's dishonest and it won't get it right anyway. But if, for example, I was going to make a joke about Navy SEALs, I might use an AI to generate a picture of a SEAL wearing a Navy uniform, because that's not a thing. But the sheer absurdity and the fact it's a joke, hopefully people will understand that it's just a little placeholder for 10 seconds to give a little bit more humour. And the final bit where I use, to a degree, AI is translation, because sometimes there just aren't any decent sources in English, but I can get either access to a digital copy of, or I can scan in a physical copy to a digital OCR PDF of a foreign language source. Now, if that source is Spanish, I can read that reasonably well anyway, but if it's in Russian or Japanese, I don't have a hope of understanding what the heck it's on about. So in those cases, what I'll do is take my OCR PDF, run it through a bit of translation software, which is actually paid for translation software. So I don't know if it counts as AI or not, because I know AI can also do translation. And then once I have the translation, I usually ping it off to somebody I know who does speak that language and say, hey, look, here's a page or two that I've had translated by translation software. Here's the original. Here's the English translation. Is it actually saying roughly what it should do? And if they say, yes, that's fine, then I can use that in making a video. So that is the full extent of my use of any kind of artificial intelligence or large language model on the channel. And I don't intend for that to change. Chief Eyeroll asks, can you briefly recount the establishment and service of the two Dutch merchant aircraft carriers and their Royal Netherlands Navy aircraft detachments? What were the unique challenges that had to be overcome to put them into service, and would you consider these vessels to be the Netherlands' first aircraft carriers? Okay, so the two ships in question are the Gedila and Makoma. This is Gedila here. You can see she is basically a tanker with a flight deck strapped to the top. And the origins of how this came about are a little bit convoluted. So both of them are merchant aircraft carriers, as you mentioned, which essentially means they're merchant ships, flight deck on top, carry some aircraft, don't usually have a hangar, still carry regular civilian cargo, and therefore have a mixed staff. So you have a general civilian crew for running the ship, but you have a Navy crew for dealing with the aircraft component. Okay, now it gets even more complicated. You see, back then you had the company Royal Dutch Shell, which you might know these days as Shell, And although Shell these days, as an oil company, is based in the UK, back then, as the name suggests, Royal Dutch Shell was based in the Netherlands, and, well, the Netherlands at that point owned the Dutch East Indies, so no prizes for guessing where they got most of their oil from. However, Royal Dutch Shell also had a subsidiary, Anglo-Saxon Petroleum, which was based in the UK, and the idea was that Anglo-Saxon Petroleum would essentially be the transport arm but separate company entity for Royal Dutch Shell. Except at one point there was an asset transfer, so there was some question as to whether was Royal Dutch Shell a subsidiary of Anglo-Saxon Petroleum, or was Anglo-Saxon Petroleum a subsidiary of Royal Dutch Shell? But that's, business wheeling and dealing that I have no real knowledge of, nor any particular interest to learn about. But the net result of this was that you had Royal Dutch Shell based in the Netherlands, Anglo-Saxon Petroleum based in the UK, technically part of the same company, but also separate companies, and there wasn't an overall, hilariously enough, Shell company to oversee them. But they, obviously this being Anglo-Saxon Petroleum, commissioned a bunch of tankers. And some of them, well, most of them to be honest, given that they were based in the UK and the size of the UK merchant fleet at the time, flew UK flags or British flags and were registered in the UK. But some of them were flagged with Dutch flags for various reasons. And two of the ones that were flagged with Dutch flags were the Makoma and the Gadila. Now, come World War II, Germans invade, etc., etc., and these two ships are among a large detachment of the Dutch merchant fleet that end up serving the Allies, obviously based in the UK. The Admiralty shows up and says, all right, we need some merchant aircraft carriers. So they grab a whole bunch of tankers from Anglo-Saxon Petroleum and convert them into what's sometimes called the Rapana class, after MV Rapana, the first ship to be converted, merchant aircraft carriers. Great, so now they've got a bunch of converted tankers used as aircraft carriers. However, the majority of the conversions were British flagged already, so they can get Fleet Air Arm crews and off they go. But as we said, these two were Dutch flagged. Now that didn't technically mean all that much in the way of problems, because the Free Dutch Navy was working alongside the Allies, so it should all be fine. But someone in the Admiralty decided it would be rather fun, if we've got Dutch flagged tankers, to put some Dutch aircraft, or Dutch air crew rather, aboard. And then you get a whole other field of complexity, because you have, the Royal Netherlands Air Force in and of itself wasn't as a sustainable thing as an independent unit, but you did have Dutch units in the Royal Air Force and the Fleet Air Arm. And so they hunted down a couple of Dutch manned Fleet Air Arm units and said, right, we're going to put a flight from your squadrons onto these two carriers. So you had Dutch flagged, but technically British owned, but ultimately technically maybe possibly Dutch owned tankers converted into merchant aircraft carriers by the British Admiralty, with Fleet Air Arm and therefore British marked aircraft, but piloted and staffed by Dutch aircrew aboard these possibly Dutch tankers, which then technically made the whole thing a Dutch aircraft carrier, because it was a Dutch flagged ship with Dutch aircrew and Dutch civilian crew, even though, as we said, the ships were operating under the auspices of a British oil company and the British Admiralty, and it was the British Fleet Air Arm that was supplying the aircraft and giving the orders. Yeah, you can see why this is confusing. But luckily it was mostly the semantics that were confusing. Outside of that, in service, it was, well, Fleet Air Arm unit goes on ship goes on convoys, aircraft are launched, aircraft are recovered, aircraft occasionally shoot at U-boats, everybody's happy. So no particular challenges there, other than, just working out who exactly these ships had actually belonged to. So would I consider these vessels to be the Netherlands' first aircraft carriers? Not quite, to be honest, because, as I said, it's still a fleet. It might be Dutch manned, but it's still a Fleet Air Arm squadron, Fleet Air Arm aircraft operating under Fleet Air Arm orders to do the bidding of the British Admiralty, even if everything involved actually afloat is Dutch, apart from the aircraft. And they're not, as far as I'm aware, although feel free to correct me if I'm wrong. But as far as I'm aware, they're not flying the Dutch naval flag. They're just Dutch-flagged tankers, because as I said, they're still technically civilian vessels. So I would say they are the first aircraft carriers to be manned by the Netherlands, but I wouldn't say they are the Netherlands' first aircraft carriers. I would reserve that honour for the first aircraft carrier that actually flew the Dutch naval ensign. Rob Smith asks, thinking about the long war cruises like the Russian Second Pacific Fleet, how did they pay for coal and food that they took on during these voyages? Obviously, credit cards at the time weren't a thing. Did they have sacks of cash, lots of gold bars, or what? It's a combination of things. Ships, if you were talking about a fleet going on a long-distance voyage, certainly, well, it was coming to an end at the time of the Second Pacific Squadron, but certainly from that time and previous, a fleet might well carry a significant amount of cash in some way, shape, or form, whether that be in their local currency or in precious metals or whatever, to trade for certain supplies. But of course, there's a limited amount that you can carry. There's a limited amount that's wise to carry. And, well, you need a lot of stuff to keep a fleet going. So that was, believe it or not, more of a kind of almost a petty cash situation. For much larger purchases, particularly with things like the Second Pacific Fleet, you would go down one of a few different routes. Firstly, you could take supplies with you. You know, just load up a bunch of supply ships with coal or food or whatever, which, to be fair, you know, the Russian Second Pacific Fleet did. They had a whole bunch of supply ships with them, because then you don't have to pay for it, because you're bringing it with you, kind of like a packed lunch. Then you have charter. So the government back home will charter a ship full of supplies, usually coal, and they will pay for it using standard peacetime methods without reference to the fleet itself, and then they'll supply the meet-up coordinates, or the fleet will tell the government where they'd like to meet up. So then agents of the Russian government, as in people authorized to act on their behalf, not Secret Service people, would approach a company and say, hey, look, we would like one of your ships full of coal to be at such and such a place at such a time full of coal, so our fleet can take that coal, and they process payments normally on land. Then you've got a third option, which is if you've got a Russian ambassador or attaché or representative of some kind, basically someone who is authorized to act on behalf of the government in a port that the fleet is approaching, they will obviously have access to either direct funds or credit lines because they work for the government, and they can then go to the local suppliers and go, hey, I want to buy this, and this, and you'll be paid via the government, via the international banking system, and then, okay, that's fine. That's pretty standard. And then the final line, which could be used, but it was somewhat more rarely used, is that because technically a warship is a mobile piece of sovereign territory of the nation in question, then you can sometimes say that, especially a flag officer, is a directly authorized representative of his government. And so in limited circumstances, particularly in terms of a large fleet, a flag officer might then be able, again, depending on the fleet and the time period, they might be authorized to issue a limited number of credit notes redeemable against government assets. So not a credit card, but kind of halfway between a credit card and a check, but redeemable against, in this case, with the Second Pacific Squadron, the Russian government. And so if a supplier accepted this, they would hand over the goods, and then they would go to a bank that has access to the international telegram system or an embassy or something and say, hey, well, look, your admiral's given me this note that says you owe me, 150,000 rubles, pay up. And hopefully you would. They would, because, well, it's the government. They kind of get embarrassed if they can't pay their debts. And if they don't, then no one else is going to sell to them on credit for a good long while. So it's in their interest to. When you get further back in the age, maybe to the age of sail, basically the era before the telegram network, where there is an international banking system, but it takes a lot longer for things to move around. And governments are occasionally a little bit more unscrupulous when it comes to paying people, you might have a slightly different variant on that, but where an admiral might draw on his own personal fortune or draw lines of credit from a bank based on who he was in order to provide for his fleet. But then he'd basically kind of like a business expense account. You'd keep the receipts and hopefully the Admiralty would reimburse you later on. But by the time of the Second Pacific Squadron, that's kind of died out because, well, admirals are nowhere near as wealthy as they tended to be in the Age of Sail, and, well, the operating costs for fleets had gone up quite considerably as well. Reaver's Rambling Recess asks, one of the things that struck me about the history of HMS New Zealand has been that the country was willing to pay for a full-price battleship, but Fisher changed this to a, relatively speaking, cost-cutting battlecruiser design. It strikes me that had negotiations dragged on a few more years, the Queen Elizabeths would then have been on the table, and supposing New Zealand was still willing to pay for one battleship given the cost and capability of the Queen Elizabeths, would Fisher have taken up that option? And if he had, what kind of chaos could another Queen Elizabeth floating around have done to the later naval treaties? Presuming that she kept her battlecruisers' luck, would this +1 -1 of squadron sizes have changed the odds much anywhere in the Battle of Jutland? Well, the politics and the circumstances surrounding the eventual selection of an indefatigable class as HMS New Zealand are so twisted that in Matthew Wright's excellent book on HMS New Zealand, they pretty much occupy 2 entire chapters. But sort of a very short, précis version of why everything was switched. I think that the 2 biggest factors were, one, there had been a lot of complaints that by essentially calling all first-rate warships back to the UK, Fisher had potentially denuded places like the China Station and the Pacific generally of a British naval presence of any substantial size. And so by turning HMS New Zealand from a dreadnought in the Grand Fleet, or what was to become the Grand Fleet, into a battle cruiser that could, in theory, spend a good chunk of its, at least peacetime, out in the Pacific, that kind of addressed some of that because, well, you had the Anglo-Japanese Naval Alliance, Russian naval power had basically been trashed, at which point the only real major threats in the Pacific would come from armoured cruisers and smaller, and a battle cruiser with its speed and firepower was the ideal thing to deal with such a threat. The other thing, I think, is that because of the relatively lackadaisical build program that the British government of the latter part of the 1900s was going through, Fisher had wanted to build quite a lot of battle cruisers and battleships, but the Royal Navy had been struggling to get even the number of battleships it wanted, and the number of battle cruisers that Fisher wanted definitely hadn't been authorised. There were, only a handful under construction. So I think it was partly also Fisher seeing an opportunity to get additional battle cruisers, which were his favoured type, under construction without having to go and beg the Treasury for more money. But nonetheless, there is potentially a slightly convoluted path whereby New Zealand could have become a Queen Elizabeth class. Now, Ward, the Prime Minister of New Zealand who actually made the offer, he would be in office until early 1912, which would mean, in theory, if he signed off on a deal right towards the very end of his premiership, he would just about be in the time zone where the Queen Elizabeth class are being considered. So, in this kind of hypothetical scenario, what could happen is, well, Australia's paying for its fleet unit, and obviously we're going to change the motivations of Fisher somewhat, but let's say, for sake of argument, that Fisher goes to New Zealand, okay, really, really appreciate your gift. However, Australia is paying for its fleet unit right now, and that will provide enough security to the Pacific for the moment. However, Fisher at this point is also in the middle of actually designing the first of the 13.5-inch ships, so he might then say to New Zealand, well, look, right this instant, if you paid for a ship of the latest design as it stands, you'd get a 12-inch ship. But honestly, we've got the We Want 8 and We Won't Wait campaign going on. The Royal Navy is being given the money for a lot of battleships anyway, but they're going to be of kind of the last generation of these 12-inch ships. If you're prepared to hold off on giving us the money for a couple of years, then at relatively minimal increased cost, you can have a much, much stronger ship, which will, look a lot better for you. And I can see Ward going for that, because he had made a big deal about New Zealand's gift to the Empire being the latest and greatest and most powerful thing. Then you have the Treasury actually opening up the purse strings a little bit, the 13.5-inch ships being designed and built in fairly short order. So perhaps Fisher and Ward would also sell it as, the Admiralty has accepted our gift, but we're just getting a little bit of more time so that we can ensure that as the maximum amount of money is raised rather than having to be taken out through a loan. And then you come back in late 1911, 1912, and the deal is done. And Fisher's going, well, I've got these brand new Queen Elizabeth class 15-inch guns, really fast. Potentially, if we don't have a war, because they're fast, they could also do the kind of sort of battle cruiser role out in the Pacific, as well as being viable battleships. Let's go for this. Because Fisher really loved the idea of the Queen Elizabeth. So yeah, in that theoretical scenario, we get a Queen Elizabeth class HMS New Zealand. In terms of what could have happened at Jutland, well, she'd be with 5th Battle Squadron, which, interestingly enough, means that's one fewer ship in the BT's battlecruiser force, although in those circumstances, weirdly enough, given an earlier question in this Drydock, you might not have seen at least the whole of 3rd Battlecruiser Squadron sent off. At that point, if you've got Australia and Indefatigable and the 5 Invincibles, you might have seen 1st Battlecruiser Squadron being the 13.5-inch ships and the 2nd Battlecruiser Squadron being the 12-inch ships, at which point you might have had 2 ships sent off for gunnery practice rather than the whole squadron. But then when the entirety of 5th Battle Squadron, presumably with New Zealand, shows up, well, that's an additional QE, additional set of 15-inch guns, additional set of good gunnery. That's going to hurt the Germans quite a bit. But in terms of the naval treaties, I think it might change the naval treaties ever so slightly, because obviously there's a lot of negotiation over exactly what kind of tonnage will be retained. But ultimately, when you look at the tonnage for the US and the UK, you get a very definite sense that tonnage limit was something that was negotiated by the British, because it essentially allows them to keep the entirety of their 15-inch fleet plus a little bit of a margin, and they get the 16-inch ships in the shape of the Nelsons. If they've got an extra 15-inch battleship around, they're not going to want any kind of treaty that's going to force them to scrap it in either the short or medium terms. And while you could argue they retained Tiger and the Iron Dukes during the 30s, and they could potentially afford to drop one of those or 2 in exchange for keeping the extra New Zealand around, I have a feeling the British would probably aim to just, bump the overall tonnage limits up just a fraction so that the long-term future of a full 15-inch armed fleet is secured. 22NF2 asks, if a dive bomber, such as a Dauntless, were to land a typical bomb load right down the funnel of a Japanese battleship, what kind of damage could it cause? It very much depends on what the bomb load is, because battleships and, most large capital ships at this point, and even cruisers for that matter, did have various forms of armoured grate in their funnels, partly to deal with potential bombs down the funnel, but also partly as a way of extending the deck armour protection and not leaving a vulnerability in the middle of it. So there's some pretty hefty metal work in the way. And that's why I say it depends on the bomb load, because if a dive bomber drops a high explosive bomb, and the thing is a lot of dive bombers did drop high explosive or general purpose bombs, then it's going to hit that funnel grate, that's going to activate the fuse, and the bomb's going to explode pretty much there. Now, that's going to lead to a couple of immediate effects. Firstly, funnel's blown out, draft is significantly decreased, that's going to decrease the ship's speed. Secondly, because the draft decreased, smoke is going to be pouring into the boiler room. That's also going to drop the ship's speed while they try and sort that out and not choke the engineering staff to death. Thirdly, there's going to be, a big fireball, which is going to be, temporarily reversing the flow of exhaust gases. So the boilers may if you like blowout, not in terms of the boilers exploding, but you might have the fires in the boilers reversing course and potentially causing damage in the boiler room. But it depends. That depends quite a bit. That may or may not happen. And you might have, shockwaves rupturing the trunking, which is going to cause even more problems. And you're going to have fragments and spalling being shot down through the trunking, which may then enter the boiler rooms and cause even more casualties. So it's definitely not a good thing. But it is recoverable to a certain degree. Obviously, though, as I said, there will be casualties, but in theory, with a bit of patching up and some ventilation and so forth, a ship so hit would be able to get underway again, albeit at a somewhat reduced speed. And in actual fact, the more modern ships and the rebuilds with extensive funnel trunking as opposed to more direct lines from boilers to multiple funnels might actually be in a somewhat better state, because the trunking obviously serves as something of a deflection. Now, if it's an armor-piercing bomb, on the other hand, that's an entirely different matter. Then it depends very much on the size and scope of the armor-piercing bomb and the size and scope of the grating. Because, a small armor-piercing bomb and heavy grating, you might get just a vaguely similar result, but potentially actually slightly less destructive than what you get with a high explosive or general purpose. But if it's a 1,000-pound semi-armor-piercing or armor-piercing bomb against the average funnel grating, it very well might get through, at which point the bomb's probably going to sail down through the trunking and explode in the upper portion of the boiler room. That's going to cause a lot more problems, because then you've got, full-on explosion and fragments going straight into not just the engineering staff, but also the boilers themselves. Depending on the size of the ship and the size of the bomb, that could potentially cripple the ship entirely. It also depends, how many boiler rooms it has, what's the layout. Because if you've got a unit system with alternating boilers and turbines or whatever, you'll lose an engine room, or a boiler room more accurately. That's bad. You lose speed. It's going to be a much more permanent loss than potentially the general purpose or high explosive bomb, but you can keep moving. Whereas if you've got an older style layout where all the boilers are clustered together in one place, you could, if you're really unlucky, lose pretty much all propulsion and be left dead in the water. Now, you'd probably, with most bombs, still be in a position where you could eventually get some boilers back online, but it would be a lot more difficult for the immediate term for that ship. Mon Squire asks, I've been reading about rogue waves and the suddenness of their arrival. The standard definition being a wave that's twice the height of the non-aggregated waves. I found no information on the depth the waves would extend. RMS Queen Mary being subjected to one and coming close to going on her beam ends, though. My question is, a submarine, from the time period the channel covers, if it's on patrol, surfaced, and the lookout spot a rogue wave, the officer on deck, being on point, recognises it, sounds crash dive, and alters course to take it bow on. With the decks awash, but some sails still above water, how much damage could the boat be expected to take? How deep would it need to go to reasonably expect not to suffer serious damage, and how soon would it be reasonably safe to surface? Well, a lot of it depends on the size of the rogue wave, because generally, obviously, if you're in a storm with big waves, then a rogue wave can be commensurately taller than those, whereas if you're in a relatively flat calm, a rogue wave that's 2 or 3 times the height of the regular waves might be barely noticeable. At which point, you end up with the fact that, if you're in a really, really bad storm, most submarines would be well underwater anyway in the time period the channel covers, which would protect them from the bigger waves unless they're in really, really shallow water. But if we assume for some reason, for a worst-case scenario, a submarine is on the surface during some fairly heavy weather, let's say, I don't know, it's run out of batteries, being chased by an enemy submarine hunter, and it's forced to come to the surface to recharge, and in the middle of this storm, a 50, 60, 70-foot wave comes barreling out of nowhere. If it's in the position that you mentioned, where it's bow on but still partially surfaced, there's a very good chance you might lose the sub, because that kind of wave, even if the wave height isn't necessarily as long as the sub, it's still going to stand the sub up, not quite on its end, but very close to it, which could have some rather dramatic effects. Firstly, you're going to have for a lot of subs that at the time that are manufactured with unsealed fuel tanks, i.e. there's a open vent in the bottom that allows water to come in while to replace fuel that's being burned. If it goes really up on its end like that, you're going to have fuel pouring out or seawater pouring in. So you're going to potentially lose a little bit of buoyancy, but more importantly, lose a lot of fuel. Similarly, for air in ballast tanks, you could potentially lose an awful lot of the air in your ballast tanks that way. So you're going to end up massively negatively buoyant all of a sudden. A lot of the cells in the batteries are open, topped. So if the sub suddenly stood up 60, 70 degrees on its stern, then you're going to have battery acid pouring out of the batteries, which is going to mean poisonous gases and, well, battery acid sloshing around everywhere inside the sub, plus almost complete loss of electrical power. Various things are going to be coming loose up to and including things like torpedoes and so forth. So there's a very good chance that, assuming the sub is still even vaguely there by the time the wave passes, it's going to be a toxic hellhole inside. Probably everybody is either injured or dead, or in the last stages of desperately trying to get out, and the sub's going to just drop like a rock to the ocean floor. That's your worst case scenario. The other thing you've got to remember, of course, is that when a wave occurs, you might have the wave on the surface, but the wave's effects are exerted further down, and the more powerful the wave, the further down it goes. So if you've got a really big wave, let's say a 50 or 60 footer, the boat's going to have to be a couple of 100 feet down to not be seriously thrown around. You wouldn't want to be 50, 100 feet below the surface. You'd still be subject to quite a lot of a battering. As and anyone in the comments who has served on a sub will tell you, simply being underwater doesn't protect you from being bounced around by a storm, for example. The deeper you go, the better. But running at 100, 150 feet with a heavy storm above you, you're still going to be being thrown around a little bit. In terms of how soon would it be reasonably safe to surface, assuming that you did go deep ahead of it, pretty quickly. Rogue waves come and they go. So, your bigger problem would be if you have a 50 or 60 foot wave, that means you've probably got 20 foot seas anyway, and you don't want to surface in those because that's fairly dangerous for the sub in any case. But if it's some kind of miracle out of nowhere thing and the weather is otherwise relatively calm, pretty much as soon as the wave's gone over you, you could start preparing to surface because the lingering effects of it are fairly minimal. Steam Mean Fighting Machine 997 asks, I've heard the US Navy wanted 16-inch guns on their battleships potentially as early as the Pennsylvania class, but the Secretary of the Navy rejected the idea in favour of 14-inch guns. So my question is, were there ever any plans to upgun the standard type battleships to 16-inch guns? My understanding is that it should be possible to swap triple 14-inch turrets for twin 16-inch turrets without too much difficulty. And if so, upgunning the Pennsylvanias, the New Mexicos, and the Tennessees should just be a matter of pulling them in for refit, which would leave just the Nevada class with 14-inch guns as they've got twins up top. Is there a reason beside cost why they didn't do this, and were there any treaty restrictions on doing so? As far as I'm aware, there weren't any concrete plans to upgun the standards. Now, this theoretically could have been done with the Tennessees. It would have been a relatively easy thing compared to the others, because while there are some differences, in a lot of ways, the Tennessees are very, very similar to the Colorados. So switching the Tennessees over to kind of Colorado-esque style would be a lot easier than the New Mexicos or the Pennsylvanias. You've also got the fact of, the different marks and models of 14-inch gun, but while the barbette diameters are, close enough that you probably could adapt a twin 16-inch turret in some way, shape or form to fit the triple 14-inch barbettes, it is quite involved because obviously you'd have to redo all the magazines as well. You'd have to completely redo the hoists. You'd basically be lifting out the entire internals. Just physically having the space to do it much as the Germans were planning to put twin 15s on Gneisenau, it is still quite a complex engineering feat, even though it could technically be done. So, could you do it? So, could you, in theory, upgrade the Pennsylvanias and the New Mexicos to twin 16s? Maybe. You'd be probably playing around with stability and weight as well. The Tennessees are a much better bet. But the reasons why they didn't do it, apart from the cost and the time, is that, yes, there were treaty restrictions. So there was actually a specific line in the Washington Naval Treaty that says, essentially, you weren't allowed to upgun your battleships. So that ruled out any idea of making California and Tennessee into additional members of the Colorado class. But the broader problem with doing this is essentially that you've got a bit of a catch-22. If you decide to do this with one of your newer ships, so looking at the US, let's say they decide to do it with the Tennessees, we're assuming before the Washington Treaty is signed, or let's say there isn't a Washington Treaty in the early 20s. Well, the problem is the Tennessees are still some of your latest and most powerful battleships, so it's going to take quite a while to do this, a year or two at least. And while you're doing that, you've taken some of your most powerful battleships offline, which significantly decreases the fighting power of your fleet, which could put you in a strategically poor situation. Conversely, if you do it to some of your older and less powerful ships, you are still reducing the available firepower to your fleet for a while, because the rest of your fleet's still going to have to do its regular refit, etc. routine, so your overall fleet strength is going to be down for a fair bit. And if you're doing it with your older ships, not only is it going to be more expensive, you're going to have to do more changes for weight and stability issues and so forth. But your final result is going to have a shorter lifespan and be less capable because, well, it's smaller and older. So if you're assuming that it's a non-treaty environment, given the cost that would be involved in giving you a lesser form of a Colorado for 5 or 10 years or so before it becomes obsolete anyway, that amount of money could probably be put significantly towards the cost of building a much larger, much more capable ship like a 1920s South Dakota, which is going to carry more guns and be more powerful and just be more modern and have a longer lifespan anyway. So weirdly, the only circumstance in which the cost of upgunning a ship makes sense is if you're going to be forced to have that ship around for several decades and you can't build anything substantially more powerful, which is basically the treaty environment, but the treaties also specifically say that you can't do this. Ferrata Victrix asks, the Corvus is credited with giving the navally challenged Romans the means to shift the nature of naval battles at the time in their favour. Are there other examples of technology fundamentally changing the nature of naval warfare to the benefit of a power that was substantially weaker at sea that then successfully turned the tide in their favour? I mean, putting aside the whole current scholarly debate as to whether the Corvus was in fact a thing at all, and if so, how effective, and there's a whole video for that at some point later on in the year. In more general terms, yes, there are quite a few examples of an advance in technology completely changing the nature of naval warfare to the benefit of a lesser power. You see that at Lepanto, for example. The switch that the Venetians make, obviously not for their whole fleet, but the switch to part of their fleet having galleasses, these, prior to this, war in the Mediterranean had guns involved, but mostly relied on ramming and boarding and using swift, fast galleys. The galleass is big, slow, and expensive, which in theory runs contrary to everything that galley warfare is supposed to be about, but being big and covered in troops and difficult to access from a smaller ship and covered in firepower, it turns out to be incredibly effective at demolishing large numbers of Ottoman galleys. The advent of long-range anti-shipping cannon, as well as longer, leaner ships, arguably completely changed the nature of naval warfare in the latter part of the 1500s, more generally, and that obviously you see an example of that with the Spanish Armada. The English fleet, in conventional combat, by the rules of normal Northern European naval warfare, even a couple of decades earlier, would have completely lost the fight against the Armada, but being able to run in and out and deliver multiple broadsides to the big galleons, using the race-built galleons, not only did that help preserve England at the time, but the race-built galleon would go on, and its immediate descendants would go on to completely reform naval warfare into a far more artillery-based operation. And of course, that helped the rise of the Dutch and the English, later the British, as naval powers as compared to France and Spain and Portugal, who had dominated previously. There are a few other examples like submarines and torpedoes, but although they did substantially and fundamentally change the nature of naval warfare, and they did give substantially weaker powers a big leg up, at least in the major conflicts, they didn't successfully turn the tide, even if they did successfully perhaps force larger naval powers to completely rethink how they did naval warfare. Coneled asks, everyone knows you can skip things off the water. I think many people have enjoyed skipping rocks at their local pond or lake. This property was also famously used by Britain with the bouncing bomb. Has anyone ever intentionally used this effect as a gunner with respect to naval artillery? And if not, are there documented cases of it happening unintentionally? Yes to both, actually. So in older times, in the age of sail, the idea of skipping cannon shot across the water, at least in calmer seas, was known of and occasionally implemented. Now, sometimes it was just a kind of a built-in helpful safety factor for navies that liked firing on the down roll, like the British, i.e. you're firing at the hull. As your hull rolls, then some of your guns might go off pointing a little bit too far down to directly hit the enemy hull, but if it's at a very shallow angle, and as I said, if the sea is relatively calm, then those rounds might skip off the water and still hit the enemy hull. Great. In very calm environments and very specific circumstances, there was occasionally a call to deliberately skip rounds off the water in the view of, well, that would allow you to get the closest to holding the enemy at the waterline, but that's usually not really so much of a thing in the classic age of sail because, one, the guns that are firing back at you are slightly higher up, and two, you generally want to try and capture an enemy ship, not sink it. But there are occasions where you do want to sink an enemy ship, particularly if you're very, very heavily outgunned. But in the early 19th century, where you're still mostly firing round solid shot, but you've got things like engines and so forth, people begin to look a little bit more into the prospects of skipping rounds to try and get as close to the waterline as possible, especially in the context of then being able to potentially knock out the enemy's engines, which might be poking just a little bit above the waterline. But it's still not very common because, as I say, if you're firing into the sea, any substantial waves, and you might end up not skipping, you might end up just smashing into the side of a wave and that's it. I mean, wasted shot is a bit different to, obviously, compared to a lake or a pond. I mean, heck, go and try and skip stones off a lake in a substantial windstorm is a lot more difficult than when it's calm. Now, when you move into the age of pointed shells, the tactic goes away almost entirely because, one, obviously, velocities are a lot higher. I mean, shells are technically a bit more fragile because they're not just solid lumps of iron. And between those two things, and obviously catching waves and so forth, firing a shell into the water with the idea to skip it would usually result in just the shell going completely haywire, cartwheeling in a relatively unpredictable manner, and probably destroying itself before it hit the target anyway, in most circumstances. However, occasionally, when guns were firing at very low angles, then the shape of the nose of the shell combined with hitting at just the right angle would occasionally make things skip in a way that they were actually still useful when they hit, although obviously that wasn't the intention. And the reason why you've had this picture in the background the whole time is because a number of accounts from HMS Rodney talk about that as she got really close to Bismarck and was delivering almost point-blank broadsides, a few sailors did actually see 16-inch shells that, through a combination of roll and so forth, went a little bit short, hit the water and then actually did skip up and continue to smash into the German battleship. Unintentional, but interesting. John McCarthy asks, I've read that sailors in the High Seas Fleet referred to the pre-dreadnoughts as the 5-minute ships, because that's how long they expected them to last in battle against dreadnoughts. Is that true? And if so, how accurate was that assessment? And doesn't 5-Minuten-Schiff sound cool? The 5-minute ship thing does appear to be true. There are plenty of contemporary accounts from the German side describing the, well, mostly Deutschlands, with the exception of Hessen, as 5-minute ships. So, pretty certain that is actually a thing. It wasn't an official name, of course. It was a nickname, but there you go. Now, how accurate was the assessment? I would say actually it's probably pretty accurate. Because when you consider the one time the German pre-dreadnoughts at Jutland actually had to fight against something with big guns, that was against Beatty's battlecruisers. So you consider the circumstances. It's Beatty's battlecruisers at night, and they're having to shift their aim suddenly from first scouting group to the pre-dreadnoughts. That is pretty much the most optimal scenario you can hope for at Jutland for the German pre-dreadnoughts. It's the worst shooting bunch of the Royal Navy's capital ships. It's in the environment that the Royal Navy hasn't really trained gunnery for, and the Germans have. Visibility is quite bad, and it's not like they've been, drawing a bead on the Germans for any length of time, because as I said, they've been chasing for a scouting group. And what happens? Well, a handful of hits come in on some of the German pre-dreadnoughts. Obviously, some of them are fairly superficial higher up, but the one or two that actually hit anything substantial lower down in the ship do quite a considerable bit of damage. One of the German pre-dreadnoughts is forced to break out of line just from one hit, and Admiral Mauve basically sees what's happening, and with the relatively small number of hits that have already happened, he just goes, yeah, no, and withdraws. And so, yeah, if it was a daylight engagement against British capital ships, I'd be surprised if they did last 5 minutes total, to be honest. Randy Topeka asks, what do you think would have happened at the Battle of Leyte Gulf if there'd been musical chairs played with the American forces left behind? So Task Force 77 ends up being hit by Center Force, and the Taffies get to take on the Southern Force. To be honest, that's probably the single worst swap you could do, because it takes a huge number of destroyers and the cruisers and the battleships out of Surigao Strait and replaces them with a bunch of escort carriers that, well, honestly, can't really fight at night, and the air groups aren't qualified for that either, and a much smaller number of destroyers and destroyer escorts. Now, obviously, Southern Force isn't that large, and it is bottled up in a strait, so Johnston and Samuel P. Roberts and Hoyle and all that lot will have some opportunity to do a significant amount of damage using their torpedoes and so forth, but there's not a lot that the carriers can do. And there's not that many destroyers and destroyer escorts available compared to what Task Force 77 had. So it is conceivable that some part of Southern Force might actually make it through if Surigao Strait is entirely just blocked by the Taffies. And the flip side, if you move Task Force 77 up to Samar, they have a lot more firepower than the Taffies, but that's also exactly the kind of task force that Yamato is designed to take on. Now, of course, Yamato's on her own, thanks to Subiansi. She doesn't have Masashi with her, and the other Japanese forces are also somewhat reduced. But I think the US is going to take a lot more casualties, because instead of having relatively fast, hard-to-hit destroyers and mistaken identity carriers wandering around with some air cover going, you're going to have a slow battle line that can't get away from Yamato, Nagato, Kongo, and Harana. The cruisers, the Japanese, well, I wouldn't necessarily say the Japanese cruisers have a huge chance against the massive cruisers that Task Force 77 brings to the fight, but it's going to last a reasonable amount of time. There's not a decisive advantage either way, except the Japanese cruisers do still have a bunch of torpedoes, which they will probably be lobbing any chance they get at the US standard battleships. Now, the US does have a significant advantage in destroyers, but there are still a number of Japanese destroyers to take on. So there is a notional advantage in lighter forces for Task Force 77, and of course it is a 6v4, and 2 of them are Congos, but one of those 4 is Yamato. So while I think Kurita's forces are still going to lose, they could take a big chunk of Task Force 77 with them. And on top of that, as I said, there is a small chance that some part of Southern Force might make it through the Taffys to hit the landing zones. So overall, switching the forces around would probably go very badly for the US. Ash the Lego guy asks, I don't recall the source, but I saw or read somewhere that depth charges, excluding direct or near direct contact hits, tend to kill submarines by the pressure wave colliding with the hulls at different points as the wave passes across them, causing flexing, which in turn causes pipes and tanks to separate or the hull to fail, and cause catastrophic flooding. With that effect, larger submarines, all things being equal, would be more susceptible to depth charge shockwave damage than smaller ones, as more of the pressure wave would hit most of the hull more evenly. Was that just made up, or is that actually the detailed physics of how depth charges sink or damage submarines? I mean, I'd say it's, if I'm being generous, I would say that's 50-50. You've got to remember, shockwaves travel very fast in water, and as far as physics is concerned, I mean, yes, in theory, if a depth charge detonates, let's say, off your port bow, then your pressure hull on the port side forward is going to be subjected to the shockwave very fractionally before the shockwave hits the aft port side or of your sub. But in terms of material stress, no. I mean, apart from anything, as I said, stuff travels really fast in water, so it's not differential pressure as in a shear force, like, with this bit of the sub's being pushed with this much force, this part of the sub isn't, but now it is, but now it's a different force. That's really not how it works. And with larger subs, there's nothing that inherently makes a larger object more susceptible to the shockwave, because yes, it's being hit by more of the energy, but obviously you're talking about force over a unit of area. If the submarine hull is equally strong, then the fact that you've hit a very large sub or a very small sub shouldn't make all that much odds, because if they are of equal strength, well, if you need a certain amount of pressure to breach the pressure hull, then, assuming the full length of the sub is the same strength, any individual point is going to be experiencing the same pressure anyway. Now, where you get a little bit more subtlety to that is that as a pressure hull gets larger, if a sub gets larger, there actually is a diminishment of strength, assuming that you're building everything to the same scale. So if you are building a larger sub, you look into war submarines, you tend to see the biggest subs actually tend to have relatively low diving depths, relatively shallow diving depths. Smaller subs sometimes can go a lot deeper. Now that's twofold. Partly because when they built subs much larger, sometimes you look at it, the pressure hull thickness and the frame layout and so forth, you might have a thinner pressure hull, you might have a wider frame layout, simply to try and keep overall weight down, and costs for that matter. And that, of course, will mean that you have a weaker hull, which will make you more susceptible to depth charges. The other thing, of course, is the effect of shaping on the strength of the hull. Because as we know, if you take a sheet of paper, well, it's very easy to bend, just wave it around in the air. If you curl that bit of paper around into a cylinder and wave it around, it'll flex very slightly, but not much. And similarly, the amount of strength you gain from having a cylindrical pressure hull, the net increase effect of that is obviously greater on a smaller pressure hull. If you have a larger pressure hull, even if it is the same thickness and the same framing distances and so forth, the actual curvature of that pressure hull is going to be less. Therefore, the effect, or the strength gaining effect of being a cylindrical pressure hull is somewhat less. So yes, assuming that you have the same build standards, a larger submarine is fractionally more vulnerable to depth charges than a smaller one, but it's not because, there's just more of the pressure wave hitting the sub. Now, yes, the shockwave can damage the sub by causing pipes and tanks and internal fittings to separate, but realistically that's damage. That's not necessarily going to sink the sub unless, something like a valve that accesses the outside ruptures and you get uncontrollable flooding. Ultimately, the thing that will really kill a sub is if you have a massive breach in the pressure hull, which can start as a small one if you're deep enough, and then that breach widens itself. However, the main way that's going to happen is that obviously your pressure hull is rated for a certain amount of pressure. You are under a given amount of pressure that's a percentage of that based on how deep you are. So let's say, for sake of argument, your pressure hull is rated for a certain amount of pressure, and you are at 75% of that pressure because you've gone fairly deep, but you're not approaching your test depth just yet. When a depth charge explodes, obviously that is increasing the local pressure, and that pressure increase dissipates with the inverse square law, so the further away the depth charge is, the less damaging it is to you. But assuming that it's close enough, when that shockwave, pressure wave hits you, the local pressure on your pressure hull increases. Now, if that increase is within that 25% margin, you'll be okay-ish. If it's above that, depending on the exact nature of the hull, because get some hulls are done better than others, as well as how flexible the material is, then you might get a breach, because obviously metal does undergo elastic deformation, which it can flex back to, and then plastic deformation, which is permanent deformation. So you might exceed very temporarily the total pressure rating of the hull, and the hull might start to fail, but obviously a shockwave goes away fairly quickly, so at that point, if it's only just exceeded it, you might end up with a dent in the pressure hull, for lack of a better term. And then as the pressure recedes, if the total pressure from the depths is still less than the new failure point of that dent part of the hull, you'll be fine. But if that brief pressure significantly exceeds the failure point of the pressure hull, then some part of that pressure hull will fail. The weakest part most likely, or just generally if it's a really, really massive overpressure. And that can be all sorts of points. It could be a thin point in the pressure hull. It could be some kind of bracing or bracket that is holding the outer casing to the pressure hull being forced in. That could cause a localized failure. It could be a poor weld seam, a rivet, anything really. But some kind of weakness, and suddenly everything's caved in. And the sea will do the rest. There is a very small margin in which what you might describe as flexing could do in a sub. And that's where you get your initial pressure wave, and that might take your sub's hull to the absolute tolerance limit. And then as the bubble of the depth charge collapses, it would have to be fairly close for this to happen, to be honest. If it's close enough that you then get a net reduction in overall pressure, a significant one, then suddenly you have a flexing of the hull outwards. And of course, the more this happens, because if you go really into the mechanics of depth charges, you can get a series of shock waves from a depth charge, but you can end up with what's essentially very rapid metal fatigue. It's being bent back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. And you can see this if you get, a thin sheet of steel or better iron or a rod or something from a hardware store. If you bend it, you have created a weak point, and if you bend it back and forth and back and forth and back and forth, eventually, depending on the grade of the material and how strong you are, eventually it will break along that line. Same reason why things like pressurized airliners have a certain hull life cycle. That's why the Comet exploded, that being the de Havilland Comet, not the spaceborne thing. In any case, you can, in theory, take a hull to an absolute limit with a very, very particular kind of depth charge hit very close by, and then the series of very rapid metal fatigue movements might cause just enough of a fracture in order for the sub to sink. But it's an almost vanishingly rare margin, because then you've been a fraction closer, it's just going to implode you anyway without all of that. And if it's a fraction further away, then the pressure drops and then subsequent increases won't do as much fatigue work on your hull. So yes, a larger sub can be more vulnerable to depth charges than a smaller one, but there are ways to mitigate that through slight changes in construction technique and so forth. But when it comes to a depth charge killing a submarine, imagining some kind of pressure wave rolling along the sub and therefore one end of the sub being under pressure and the other not, and that causing the hull to bend and flex and that causes the failure, that's not really accurate. Lord Quack King of the Ducks asks, you've mentioned in passing several times a paddle wheel anti-aircraft ship that defended London or the London docks, I believe. Could you go into a bit more detail about that particular vessel or vessels? So there were a few different paddle wheel anti-aircraft ships in Royal Navy service during the Second World War. This is one of them. And they didn't defend the London or London docks. They defended the Thames estuary, which is close by, for the most part, that is. There were one or two further up and down the country, because as I said, there were a few of them. But you could find the highest concentration of paddle-wheeled anti-aircraft vessels in the Thames estuary just to the east of London. Now, the reasons for these conversions I've gone into in previous questions, but broadly speaking, at the beginning of the war, the Royal Navy requisitioned quite a few paddle steamers, mostly cross-channel paddle steamers and ferries. They did end up using a bunch of them at Dunkirk, but the theoretical reason for requisitioning a lot of them was actually as minesweepers, partly because, well, they were requisitioning a lot of stuff as minesweepers, and partly because the relatively shallow draft side paddle propulsion system actually lent itself to minesweeping for a number of reasons, including, of course, agility. But very quickly, some bright spark in the Royal Navy realised that at least some of these ships could be very useful as anti-aircraft vessels, because as ferries, or ex-ferries at this point, they had fairly large open decks, so they could mount a reasonable number of anti-aircraft guns. They were fairly agile, which was, and as I said, shallow draft, which was quite good for harbours because it meant that they could manoeuvre quite well in narrow confined waters without any real need of further assistance. And ultimately, it turned out the Royal Navy actually had a pretty good handle on a number of hulls for minesweepers, so they could spare these specific ships. And as I've mentioned in previous videos as well, it was quite handy to have a nice concentrated battery of anti-aircraft guns that you could either place next to a key target to directly defend it if needed, or if you felt that that might make that target a little bit too obvious of a target, or you needed better fire angles, you could just move your floating anti-aircraft battery pretty much anywhere you wanted to within the harbour. This is one of the beauties of the paddle steamer setup. So this example, the Royal Eagle, was turned into an anti-aircraft vessel pretty quickly. Another example that's got a fair number of photos of HMS Sandown, she actually served as a mine layer and a transport for the first part of the war, and then was then converted to an anti-aircraft vessel in 1942. And Royal Eagle is actually credited with a number of kills against Luftwaffe aircraft in the Thames estuary. So yeah, she did a pretty good job. Scott Jennings asks, during the period the channel covers, there have been a few classes of ship that, due to choices or compromises made during the design process, were particularly likely to damage themselves purely through the performance of their intended functions, like sailing through the ocean or firing their own guns. Was there ever a member of one of these ship classes that was lost in combat or suffered greater damage from enemy action than it otherwise would have as a direct result of this self-inflicted damage? Not in the specific way that you describe. Now, there are some ships that arguably were lost or captured in part because of design problems with them. I mean, there's obviously an ongoing discussion as to not necessarily whether or not Guerriere would have lost. It's fairly likely she would have, but whether Guerriere would have lost as quickly as she did against the Constitution if she'd been a British-built ship instead of a relatively lightly built ex-French prize. So that's not a case of self-inflicted damage causing the loss of the ship, but perhaps a ship class that is a bit too lightly built for comfort, taking more damage from enemy fire than otherwise relatively quickly. Now, of course, there are some ships that are captured because in a chase they lose a mast or something to the storm, and you could argue that perhaps those ships, again, if they were more lightly built than their pursuers, that could have caused them to obviously suffer damage that then results in their capture. Although how and when you lose a mast in a storm in the edge of sail is a very variable thing. But ultimately, a ship that, through some kind of design flaw, would very badly damage itself to the point that this could compromise its capability to fight the enemy, generally speaking, would be sent back for remedial works to try and patch that up, because there's a bit more damage than we're comfortable with, and then there's, significantly degrading its combat capabilities. But in the slightly less severe realm of things, you can look at ships like, for example, HMS Rodney, who as a Nelson-class battleship was known for causing a reasonable amount of mostly cosmetic, but occasionally not so cosmetic damage to itself when firing its main guns at various angles. And although some of those issues had been addressed in the interwar period, ultimately when she went up against Bismarck, the most damage she received from Bismarck was a few splinters from nearby shell hits, but she did do a fair number on her own decking and crockery from the shockwaves of her guns firing. So ultimately, although she didn't suffer any severe damage in all of that, Rodney did actually do more damage to herself in the battle with Bismarck than Bismarck actually managed to do to Rodney. Pedden Harley asks, Track, would you mind commenting on the Battle of Fort Sullivan for June 28th, 1776, from the Royal Navy perspective? What impact did it have on the careers of the officers in command, and what was its impact on further operations? The battle looms quite large in the mythology of South Carolina and is commemorated on the state's flag. The fact that said defences were unable to defend the city in 1780 is generally not mentioned. So in terms of the careers of the officers in command, it didn't really have all that much effect. The admiral in charge, Peter Parker, well, he went on to command a variety of other successful naval actions or be part of them. And yes, that's the same Peter Parker who would later be a kind of early boost to Admiral Nelson's career. And he eventually made Admiral of the Fleet. So the loss of the battle for Fort Sullivan didn't really affect him all that much. The guy in charge of the land troops for the British was General Clinton, and, well, he would be one of the main officers during the rest of the US War of Independence, and, of course, spoiler alert, Clinton lost that particular war. Opinion on him seems to be a little bit varied, but he doesn't seem to have had all that much in terms of an active command after the US Civil War, but US War of Independence, sorry, the Civil War was much later. But I think that's more to do with the fact that he lost North America, or at least the 13 colonies part of it, rather than any particular loss in this particular engagement. In terms of further operations, it did hamper British operations somewhat, because the whole point of this particular action had been to essentially try and circumvent and cut off supplies for some of the northern states who, places like Boston, which had been a hotbed of American independence sentiment. The idea being that if the British could take some of the southern states, then they could obviously, well, one, diminish the overall threat, shorten the front, but also cut off economic supply to the northern states, which would make it easier to bring them to heel, as well as obviously opening up a second front from which they could attack. So their failure to actually, deal with this particular fort and then obviously take Charleston, it did set back British strategy by a reasonable amount. It can force them to try and work out other tactics, which obviously historically didn't work out in the end. And in terms of the action itself, I would say that it probably reflects a failure to adequately survey the battlefield beforehand, because there was the primary British strategy, which was to land a couple of thousand troops on a nearby island, then wade across the shallows to attack the fort, which was part completed. That probably would have worked, especially under the cover of naval gunfire, except for the fact that they'd misjudged the depth of the water between the islands, and it turned out you couldn't do that, so you now had a couple of thousand troops stranded, rather uselessly. But with the main element of the attack failing, there was another backup option, which was to send some ships around to basically essentially pincer the main American gun platforms on the fort. And the American troops there basically said, yeah, if that had actually worked out, we would have been done for, except for the fact that, again, British had failed to survey the battlefield properly, missed a sandbar, and the ships they sent instead went aground and weren't able to conduct that. So, in theory, the British plan was actually a pretty good one and should have worked, and they had a backup that also should have worked, but because they'd failed to properly survey the battlefield, they ended up with too much water in one place and too little water in another, and were left basically fighting a battle that was pretty much the best that the Americans could hope for. And thus the British were forced to withdraw. Now the Pronhong Sharon asks two related questions. Firstly, how effective or ineffective were lightweight shells? I just realised the German 15-inch 45 actually fires a shell that's almost as light as the King George V's 14-inch shells, but does so at 2,600 FPS at the muzzle. Compared with the Italian idea of a really heavy shell, but at 2,200 FPS, what do you think the penetration difference is? Also, with the fact that the Germans measure the length of the entire gun, it's actually more of a 42 caliber, so it almost feels like the Italians would have better penetration at actual battle ranges. This is for the Caraccio's 15-inch. And then related to that, given that the Littorio's 15-inch guns weighed about the same as the Colorado's 16-inch, if you were the one who made the decision, would you have opted for a 16-inch 45 gun instead? And if so, would barrel life still be an issue? So when it comes to lightweight shells, the theory runs that if you have the same amount of energy in the gun barrel, then a lighter weight shell should accelerate faster and attain a higher top speed. And since when you're talking about kinetic energy, obviously kinetic energy is half mv squared, thus v is a much more predominant factor. So a slight reduction in mass, but a significant increase in velocity should give you, in theory, a greater kinetic energy, which should improve your penetration. The theory, however, really depends on what kind of range you're expecting to be fighting at. Because while, yes, the penetration of a lightweight shell is greater at shorter distances, air resistance and a variety of other factors mean that your velocity drops off somewhat quicker than a heavier shell, which has more inertia, and thus, because you have a starting lower mass anyway, at some point the penetration of your lightweight shell drops below that of the heavyweight shell, and then as the distance increases, the heavyweight shell's penetration remains higher at a larger and larger margin. Now, obviously, exactly where that crossover point occurs is going to vary depending on exactly how fast the shells are being fired, exactly how heavy those shells are, and whether or not any of this is useful to you, as I said, depends very much on the battle ranges you're expecting to fight at. To be fair, if you're expecting to fight at about, on average, I would say about 15,000, 16,000 yards or less, then having a lighter weight shell probably has something going for it, because if you're fighting at 11, 12, 13,000 yards, you probably do have a slight margin of penetration over the heavier shells. And obviously, because you're traveling faster, the shell trajectory in that closer ranges can be flatter, which makes it more likely you're going to hit closer to perpendicular, which is also going to help your penetration. But if you're expecting to fight, in the mid to high teens and beyond, then because your shell is now traveling slower, it's going to be dropping in higher, so the angle of impact is going to be greater, so penetration is going to be less, on top of the fact you're going slower and have less mass, so kinetic energy is going to be less, and suddenly the tables have turned. So if you're comparing the Barden and Caraccio's guns, then in theory the Bardens would have an advantage in a close-range firefight somewhat. The Caraccio's would have an advantage in a medium to longer range firefight. So if we were going to use the Battle of Jutland as the yardstick, then yeah, the Caraccio's would probably be the better bet, at least gunpowder-wise. And then with the Littorio question, Would I opt a 1645 instead of a 15-inch? Well, the 1645 fires considerably slower shell, so therefore, yeah, barrel life is going to be considerably better than the Italian 15-inch 50 on the Littorios. But remember, it's not just about the gun weight. A 16-inch shell and its charges are slightly larger and slightly heavier than a 15-inch, so for the same amount of magazines, you're not going to be able to carry quite as many rounds, and your hoists, your gun cradles, all of that is going to need to be somewhat bigger, somewhat heavier. So even though the guns might be of roughly similar weight, the overall impact of having a 16-inch 45 gun on the Littorios would be a net increase in weight and a slight decrease in ammunition count, even if notionally the 16-inch 45 would probably give you more consistent results. But then again, given the Italians weren't intending to keep with the treaty with the Littorios, you probably don't need to worry too much. But I think what it would come down to is that if I was building the Littorios, in terms of retrospective looking back at things, yes, having the 16-inch 45 would give you more consistent gunnery results, therefore the Littorios would be more effective, and it would be worth expanding the design ever so slightly to have those instead of 15-inch 50s. However, from an Italian perspective at the time, there's a question of, do you have the gun foundries capable of manufacturing a 16-inch 45 gun? Do you have the money to be able to afford the expansions to the Littorio design that you'd need to fit the 16-inch 45? And if you realise what the issues are with the 15-inch 50, do you actually have the capacity to address those? And in theory, I think you could address the issues with a 15-inch 50, at which point those weight issues and other advantages might make it a better choice to retain that gun. Little Dweller asks, during World War II, were the ships of the US Service Force manned by US Navy personnel, or were they operated by civilians? And were the ships that supported the Royal Navy operated by the RFA, the Royal Fleet Auxiliary? In both cases, the answer is somewhat mixed. So, US Navy Service Force ships, like you can see the tanker Guadeloupe here, generally speaking, on the front line, were manned by US Navy personnel. And in the rear echelons, in terms of, like, say, getting fuel from the States to Pearl Harbor, or from Pearl Harbor to Espiritu Santo, those ships might have civilian crews. But as the fleet expanded and as demand increased, towards the end of the World War II Pacific campaign, you did begin to see some civilian crews on ships that were being put on, relatively speaking, frontline duties, aka refueling the fast carrier task force right behind the actual operational front line. So at the sharp end, you're looking at US Navy personnel, but basically the further back towards the US you get, the more and more you're looking at civilians operating their ships. Now, if we switch over to the Royal Navy and, well, look at the ships supporting the Royal Navy, let's say in the Pacific, it's a very mixed bag. Yes, you have the RFA. The RFA's been around at that point for 40-ish years, coming up 40 years. But you've got a mixture of chartered civilian ships, RFA ships, and RFA personnel are their whole own special thing. They are employed by the Ministry of Defence, but technically civilians. They are technically Royal Navy personnel in one respect, but not strictly in most. That they really straddle the line between, civilian sailors and naval sailors. But the RFA was only a part of the force that was supporting the Royal Navy at that point. As I said, there were chartered civilian ships, and there were also actual warships. So, HMS Unicorn, for example, mostly operated with the ships that supported the Royal Navy, but as their name suggests, HMS, she is actually a fully fledged commissioned Royal Navy warship manned by Royal Navy sailors. And, it goes back and forth. Basically, when you look at the British support forces in World War II, if the ship is actually named RFA, insert name here, it'll be manned by RFA personnel for the most part. But you can also find a lot of ships in the service force that are HMS, and those will generally be Royal Navy sailors. Spintanium, excellent name by the way, asks, in your episode on Operation Rheinebung, it was mentioned that Admiral Lutyens had about 40 personnel in his staff. That seems like a lot considering there are only 2 ships under his flag. If memory serves, Admiral Lee had far fewer, some of whom were on detached service. What factors determine an admiral staff's size? Is it up to their personal preference, or are some positions mandated by headquarters? It depends on the Navy, but generally speaking, a flag officer at the time of the Channel, especially World War II, would be expected to have a staff, and there would be a certain minimum number that the Navy would expect you to have, but usually specific positions weren't mandated, partly because if you were going to have a small staff, you might have one person filling multiple positions and therefore saying, well, you must have a person who does this. It's like, well, yes, I have a person who does that, but he also does this, this, and this. It could lead to confusion. So it was usually more, you must have people to fulfill the following roles, and whether you had one person to do that role, 2 people to do that role, or one person who did 3 roles, that's partly down to the Admiral. Now, Admiral Lee, yes, he had much fewer staff than Lutyens, but Admiral Lee was actually quite the exception when it came to World War II flag officers. He was known for having a very small staff. The average flag officer's staff size was somewhat larger than the personnel that Admiral Lee assembled. Lutyens, on the other hand, is towards the upper end of things with the size of his admiral staff. I just realised, you're talking about admiral staffs all the time. There's an untapped mine of innuendo in this particular answer. But nonetheless, when you are assembling your staff, to a certain extent, when you get past a certain size, it almost starts to become self-perpetuating, because if you have, say, someone who's going to be your flag captain, so that's a fairly standard position, okay, well, the flag captain has a bunch of roles. But if you feel that you want to give your flag captain some other duties, or you really, really want to get him to concentrate on some very specific issues, then you might think, well, actually, the whole typing everything up thing, well, maybe he doesn't have time for that, so I'm going to get him someone who's going to be a secretary. And likewise, are you going to write up your instructions, or are you going to need a secretary to do that? How many instructions do you intend to give? Are you going to try and micromanage everything, or are you going to be a bit more hands-off? If you're going to micromanage everything, and you want everyone else in your staff to micromanage everything, then you might need more than one secretary for any given number of personnel. If you're intending to send a lot of signals, then you might need more than one person to work on signals back home. Encryption, decryption, and so forth. If you're not intending to send that many signals, then you need fewer people. And bear in mind, with Lutyens, he had to deal not just with the ships he was on, he also technically had to have some kind of liaison with the Luftwaffe, because that's technically who his scouting aircraft belonged to. He also was subject to a navy that really liked its updates. He also had a few additional things to consider, like the fact that he had potential prize crews on board, so he had to have some staff who were potentially going to have to deal with capture and processing of merchant vessels. And so this and a whole bunch of other stuff meant that I have a feeling with his staff, they probably snowballed into a much larger organisation than even he was expecting. Volunteer per order O'Sullivan asks, practical offensive operations for the Royal Navy in World War I. In the second volume of From the Dreadnought to Scapa Flow, various offensive plans for the Royal Navy are mentioned, including a fireship raid on Heligoland, raids on Borkum or Sylt, the capturing of Heligoland, Sylt, Borkum, Zeebrugge, Nieuwpoort or Alexandretta, the landing of armies on Pomerania or Schleswig-Holstein, or the laying of extensive coastal minefields. None of these schemes, and doubtless many more similar, were ever executed, and all but the landing on Nieuwpoort were never even pursued. Were any of these schemes actually practicable, and what is your opinion of such schemes? The author doesn't have a very high opinion of them, and perhaps with good reason. However, persons far more knowledgeable than me on the land campaign have endorsed Operation Hush, as for the sacrifice of an understrength division, many German divisions could have been diverted. I think it very much depends on the year that you're looking at when it comes to some of these operations. Now, some of the stuff, like landing armies in Pomerania and so forth, I don't think is ever really practical. The problem with going after targets in occupied Belgium is that there's actually a relatively narrow window between where the German front line is and the Dutch border. Now, I think of the schemes that were dreamed up, there are potentially some windows where either those schemes or variants on those schemes could have worked. And I think if I was going to go for any of them, it would be the ones that involve landing somewhat behind German lines on the Belgian coast, because that's pretty close to the UK. Landing on the German coast, there'd be less immediate opposition because most of the German army is elsewhere, but it just involves sailing far too long and far too far through German minefields, and opens you up to all sorts of U-boat and destroyer and torpedo boat attacks and so forth, unless you somehow achieve magical surprise and you're not there for very long, which a landing doesn't really facilitate. But landing a little bit behind the main front lines in Belgium and then going on to specifically, I think, target German supply lines, so railway lines, warehouses, long-range artillery, etc., as a kind of smash and grab raid, I think the Royal Navy could bring enough firepower to bear at the landing zone to attain superiority for a while to allow the operation to begin. Now, I wouldn't go for, again, full-on army landing, but enough troops to take and hold the beachhead and then, expeditionary forces to go in and do the damage to the German logistics and thus overall occupy German attention, starve the front line of supplies and get them to divert troops to weaken the front line so that an assault on the front lines might have more success. I think that certainly would have a reasonable chance of success. And the reason I mention the time is because I think the time when these kind of things might work would be at either end of the war. In the middle of the war, everybody's very heavily entrenched. There's artillery batteries everywhere. There's not a huge amount, I think, that you could do. But at the beginning of the war, the situation is a lot more fluid. So you'd have a much greater proportional effect by landing troops behind the German lines. And towards the latter stages of the war, once you have armoured cars and smaller tanks, I wouldn't necessarily, apart from maybe holding the beachhead, take the big tanks like the Mark IVs, but for your expeditionary forces, smaller tanks like the Whippets and so forth might go fairly well with the armoured cars. And in those circumstances, you might actually see a reasonable amount of success, because a combined Whippet light tank armoured car force can move a heck of a lot faster than infantry. They'll obviously carry significantly heavier firepower. They'll have protection against small arms fire, and they can get in, do a heck of a lot of damage to the German rear echelons, and then get out again. And there's not a huge amount the Germans would have behind the lines that could really deal with them all that much. And, just make sure you take a slightly oversupplied force, because then if you do have a few vehicles knocked out, you should have the capacity to pick up their crews. So in those circumstances, I think that you could have some utility, but kind of 1915, 1916, probably a bad idea. The other two variants, which I could see potentially working that aren't specifically listed here, and they're more my own invention, to be honest, but I think the Royal Navy could have carried them out, would either have been a covert insertion of forces into Antwerp, not in terms of regular line forces, but kind of, if you like, special agents, because Antwerp is, of course, a major hub of transportation. So if you could get undercover forces to sabotage transport links and so forth, especially railways, that could severely hamper German operations for a while. And the other thing, which again maybe towards the mid to late war could be quite interesting, would be where you have the carrier raids, like the Cuxhaven raid and so forth going on. Take a leaf out of that book and also a leaf out of some of the early war activities. So in the early part of World War I, it wasn't unknown for aircraft to take off with small demo charges, and for the pilot to just land his aircraft in a field behind the enemy lines, set some charges on a train track or so, something like that, and then just go back to his aircraft and take off again. Now, where this could have some utility would be if you had, say, a small two-seater or a rough field one-seater loaded similarly, but then loaded onto the Royal Navy's early carrier force. If you could then take that force close-ish to the German coastline, i.e. within aircraft range, and send those aircraft out, obviously the Germans don't have anywhere near enough forces to police the entire length of their railway network within Germany itself, and these aircraft could then fly to the isolated transport links, perhaps tunnels or just major lines in the middle of fields and so forth, set a whole bunch of demolition charges, and then leave. Now, of course, that would mean you'd have to have your recovery forces nearby, but of course, if you load the aircraft up with fuel and launch them fairly close, then perhaps they can fly out somewhat further to get home. And again, the disruption effect of suddenly having a whole bunch of, points and tunnels and bridges and railway lines severed could have a fairly significant impact on German logistics on the front line, but you would have to also time everything to try and exploit that. John Plate asks, what was French carrier doctrine like before World War II? I realise they only had Bern in the interwar years, but they were getting 2 new Joffre class. I did a little reading, and the French didn't seem to think they would survive the threat of land-based air power, so they were going to use them to catch merchant raiders. How well do you believe they would have fulfilled that goal? They were never completed, but how would they have compared to other carriers? Well, as I've detailed with other videos, for Bern, the Marine Nationale had essentially moved to the idea of Bern conducting independent operations, which basically meant, merchant ship hunting or merchant raider hunting, maybe with some escort, mostly because she was so hopelessly slow that she could never really operate with a fleet, even before you got things like the Dunkirks that could actually move pretty quickly into service. Again, as I've covered before, part of the big problem was, yes, in theory, Bern was about as fast as the Corbett's and the Britannias. The issue then was, well, if she had to divert away from the battle line to conduct flight operations, because the wind might not be cooperating with you, she would take a small glacial epoch to catch back up with them. Now, as far as the Joffre class, I think the French were probably onto something when they came to their deductions about the class. They're relatively small fleet carriers, therefore a small air group, no significant protection. So, if you look at the battering the British armoured carriers took in the Mediterranean, a smaller, less well-protected Joffre, the French were pretty smart in saying I don't think that's going to survive very long. So putting them out at sea, it makes sense. France has a requirement, if it's going to engage in a prolonged war, for overseas resupply. It has a lot of ports, and merchant raiders could potentially be a major problem. And I think the Joffres probably would have done a fairly decent job of that. They're relatively quick. They've got, admittedly, a small air group, about 40, but it's planned to be 15 fighters and 25 twin-engine aircraft that can do reconnaissance, torpedo strike, or bombing. That actually gives them a reasonable number of scouts to try and find a target, and because of the multi-purpose nature of those twin-engine aircraft, they can then show up with a fairly decent strike package to deal with any potential target. If the Joffres had been completed, they would have been an absolute nightmare for things like the Deutschlands or the Scharnhorsts, because, the Deutschlands are fairly small, but even for the Scharnhorsts, if your theoretical Joffre is able to use its, let's say, send up a patrol of long-range twin-engined aircraft to find the target, they can then sustain, hold the target via aerial recon, and then as the ship closes and some of the recon aircraft break off to refuel and rearm, then they can send out some of the fighters to maintain contact and maybe 1 or 2 new scout aircraft, which would then mean that you'd be looking at maybe 12 to 18 twin-engine torpedo bombers coming in, potentially with fighter support to suppress the lighter anti-aircraft guns. And there's not really a huge amount the Scharnhorst could do about it. And a dozen to 18 torpedo bombers arriving at once, that's where you're starting to talk about, yeah, you're probably, you're not talking about will you hit, you're talking about how many hits you're going to land. So for their design role, they would have probably done fairly well. Compared to other carriers, generally, I think they'd probably come off relatively poorly, but then, even the illustriouses are bigger than them and in the end can sustain a slightly larger air group while having the protection. The Yorktown's a little bit bigger, much bigger air group. The Essex is much bigger and bigger air group. But with their displacement, the Joffres, they're not quite light fleet carriers. They do still displace a little bit more and can carry a few more aircraft, and certainly larger aircraft than something like an Independence class. But I think if you're going to compare them to other carriers, they're in that slightly awkward space between the light carrier and the fleet carrier. Probably the best thing to compare them to would have been maybe the Colossus class, but even then that's a little bit unfair because the Colossus class are almost a decade later in terms of design profile. My name is Guybrush Threepwood and I'm a Mighty Pirate asks, in Tom Clancy's Red Storm Rising, the author states that unlike the US Navy, the Royal Navy assigned call signs to helicopters that were associated with the vessel to which they were attached. For example, in the novel, the vessel HMS Battle Axe's helicopter has the call sign Hatchet. Is there any truth to this? And if so, are there any humorous examples? Sadly, as helicopter operations generally fall outside the scope of the channel, except for a very few early ones, I honestly don't know. If anybody in the comments has either served in the Royal Navy or knows a lot more about the Cold War / post-Cold War era Royal Navy than I do, and therefore knows anything about the call sign habits of Royal Navy helicopters and their frigates and destroyers, please let us know, because I'd actually be quite interested in knowing the answer as well. Andrew Dederer asks, what was the hold-up on writing doctrine in the Royal Navy in World War I? Given the just follow orders vibe already in place, was it seen as treading on the commander's authority or right to write his own? I think it was just the fact that for most of the stuff that you'd want to write doctrine for outside of general battles, the Royal Navy didn't really have much idea of what would happen, because you have the Royal Navy fighting instructions. So that gives you an idea of how captains are supposed to conduct themselves in the face of the enemy, and that does cover a certain degree of doctrine. The fighting instructions are updated every so often. But they're more of a general guide of like, this is how your ship is expected to fight in a battle. In terms of overall doctrine, the Royal Navy, both in World War I and World War II, although in World War I obviously they are looking more and more towards the Germans, they are still looking at, well, we could be expected to fight anywhere, anytime, across the planet, in any strength against any arbitrary potential counter-strength, at which point trying to write a doctrine for every single permutation of conflict is pointless, because you'd end up with a small library of doctrine documents and no one would read them anyway. And given those multiple permutations, yeah, it was pretty much seen as, well, we have trained our admirals and flag officers and other flag officers like commodores and captains in leadership, and they should have some experience, at which point, if they find themselves in a situation, they should have the knowledge to basically come up with how they're going to prosecute that particular situation, and we probably don't need to be telling them exactly how this is going to be done. And I mean, even when you look at the Grand Fleet, which is obviously a relatively narrow set of doctrinal principles, because their main objective is to find and kill the high seas fleet, even then, when you consider any detailed discussion of what could have been done at Jutland, and there's a dozen different potential plans, all of which completely exclusionary to the other, all of which would be incredibly detailed and complicated, and a lot of it would be context dependent. So again, I think essentially the Royal Navy had dropped into an idea of, we have some vague ideas about how we might do some of the larger overarching things, but realistically it's up to the commander on the scene to determine how exactly he's going to be doing stuff. Chris Balance asks, did the Italians ever attempt to design their own version of an Elektroboot before September 1943? And did the Germans pass along information about their own developments regarding sonar, snorkels, batteries and electric motors, etc.? As far as I'm aware, unless there's some niche paper sketch plan out there, no, the Italians didn't really look at any kind of Elektroboot style design. Bearing in mind that even the German designs for Elektroboats were something of a last minute thing after the failure of the Walther underwater propulsion system. And for the Germans, the U-boat arm was a fairly major part of the Kriegsmarine. For the Italians, the surface elements of the Regia Marina, while, not absolutely take priority over everything, the Italians did still value their subs. The surface elements of the Italian Navy were far more important to them than the surface units of the Kriegsmarine were to the Germans in terms of strategy and resources. Obviously everybody valued their ships, but when the Italians were looking at how are they going to fight a war, they're looking at primarily fighting a surface war with submarine involvement, whereas the Germans are looking primarily at fighting a submarine war with surface support and involvement. And as a result, the Italians also with the limited resources, they're essentially looking at continuing to construct submarines roughly based on their pre-war designs, but they're not in any particularly great hurry about it for the most part. So, as far as I'm aware, the Italians didn't really seem to show any particular interest in a high-speed underwater, mostly heavy battery-powered Elektroboot type design before the armistice. Now, in terms of the Germans passing on information, there was some information transfer, but as I've indicated before, while theoretically Germany and Italy were supposed to be sharing a lot of technology, both sides were in reality very much more a kind of, yes, I promise I will share my technology, but first you share some of yours. So while both sides did actually have a bunch of technology that could have been quite helpful to the other, very often that was kind of held back and delayed while they were waiting for the other country to send some of their examples first. And with both of them doing it, you had very delayed technology transfers, if they happened at all. And sometimes both sides would kind of sit on particular bits of technology and just essentially ignore requests from the other party to have a look. Camino John asks, while wrapping up my Camino and time in Spain, I've paid a visit to the Alcazar in Segovia. Contained within this fortress is a museum to the Royal Artillery of Spain. The museum traces the history, including manufacturing efforts, from its early formation to about 1850. One interesting display was 2-scale miniatures of a cannon, one mounted for the army use, while the other was mounted for naval use. This sparked the following 2 questions. Firstly, have you paid a visit to Alcazar? And second, during the Classic Age of Sail, what was the interplay between the Navy and the Army in terms of artillery development? Were technology developments by the Army driven by the Army or the Navy, and was it different in England, France, Spain, Holland, Venice, Denmark, etc.? So during the Classic Age of Sail, there wasn't a huge amount of interplay between naval and army artillery for the most part. Now, in some smaller nations, there was a lot more interplay, simply because, well, there's only a limited demand for cannon, so everybody better cooperate. But in the bigger nations, there's quite a big distinction. For one thing, in the Classic Age of Sail, the average naval gun carriage, like you can see here, is a very heavy built 4-wheeler. And that's there mostly for strength, durability, and to help absorb the recoil, and for easy handling on a ship's deck. It is perhaps one of the least suited gun carriages for moving around over land. You look at army gun carriages in the period, and they tend to be large, 2-wheeled affairs with relatively light carriages, because you need to save every pound you possibly can, and you need nice big wheels to move over rutted terrain and so forth. And of course, you don't have to worry as much about recoil because, well, if recoil is a real problem, you can dig a gun pit, which you can't really do on a ship. And most normally, you've got a whole bunch of land to use as your recoil absorbent space, whereas on a ship, you really don't have all that much room. The other thing is gun weight, kind of like actually in World War I and World War II. The typical field guns that you would find in, let's say, a Napoleonic battlefield, you're going to have 3-pounders, 6-pounders, 9-pounders, 12-pounders would be considered fairly large. Anything heavier than a 12-pounder on a typical Napoleonic battlefield would be unusual. And something like a 24-pounder would, now you're talking siege artillery, mate. Whereas at sea, minimum price of admission by the Napoleonic period is basically the 9-pounder. Yeah, there were a few small guns out there, but not that many. So the vast majority of army-grade artillery, carriage issues aside, would be considered laughably small by naval standards, even on a frigate. And on a ship of the line, where you start out at the 12 and the 18-pounders as the light guns, and you go up to the 24 and the 32-pounders as your heavy guns, and you have dozens of them, it's a whole different ball game. And so as a result, while there might be a little bit of crossover in the, high single digits category, even there's not going to be quite so much crossover because, of course, for the Navy, long-term durability and reliability is important, so they're more willing to accept heavier barrels, whereas, again, for the Army, you want something as lightweight as possible, so you don't need to use every single horse in the country to pull it across the land, which means lighter weight barrels, which the Navy's just not going to accept, really. And then you've also got demand. An Army might demand several hundred cannon total, and Navy will demand several hundred cannon just for a couple of ships, let alone a fleet. Now, switching back to the first part, have I paid a visit to Alcazar? No, I haven't. My travels in Spain are actually relatively limited. Now, you might think that's a little bit odd, given that I am half Bolivian, but diverting off into DRAC personal law for a second, while at some point I definitely do want to visit various naval museums and other interesting locations from a maritime perspective in Spain, Spain is not very high on my list of countries I'd really like to visit again. I visited twice, and both times the experience has been relatively unpleasant. And I think I may have mentioned this in some previous Drydocks or something like that, but basically the problems I've experienced visiting Spain, now admittedly this is mostly the southeast of Spain, so I don't know if there's any kind of regional issues going on there or whatever. Maybe some Spanish viewers might enlighten me in the channel. But essentially the three problems I've run into is that previously when I've gone there, I've obviously gone there with my family, my mum, my dad, my brothers, because this was a few years ago. And my mum obviously is Bolivian. It turns out the people in that area of Spain, at least, really, really, really don't like South Americans. To the point that we actually had to leave several restaurants because the restaurant servers just flat out ignored us, even though, of course, my mum can speak fluent Spanish. So it wasn't a language barrier. It was just, no, you South American colonial scum, we don't want you here. That was the kind of vibe I got. And then, of course, the rest of my family is, apart from my middle brother, looks very, very English. So somewhat more understandably, maybe the Spanish don't seem to be that keen on the old gringos wandering around. So yeah, combine very obviously British and very obviously South American, and apparently that makes us persona non grata, at least in that area of Spain, 10, 15 years ago or so. And then for some reason, despite the fact that my mum can speak Spanish, and therefore by inference, the rest of us should at least be able to understand it, which, to be fair, we do to varying degrees, a bunch of the locals seemed to think that we didn't understand Spanish in any way, shape or form, and then we were kind of listening in on all the horrible things they were saying about us and kind of going, should we indicate to them we do actually know all the stuff that they're talking about or not? Which obviously isn't very present. I mean, with me being half Bolivian, half English, and therefore looking like I could be from anywhere, but also nowhere north or south of the Sahara, I'm an old hat at dealing with people being racist, but oh boy, did the people we found in Spain really take it to the nth degree. And then it gets even worse when I actually try to speak to anybody, because of course, if I go up to someone and I start speaking in English, they're like, "Ah, yes, I didn't know where you were from. You're British. Great, fantastic. I hate you already." And if I go and try and speak to them in Spanish, of course, I speak in South American dialect of Spanish, which is actually correct pronunciation, at which point they go, oh, yes, I didn't know where you were from. Dirty, ungrateful colonial, I hate you already. And if I switch from one to the other, they're like, oh, look, dirty, ungrateful colonial who also is English. I hate you maximally. Yeah, I don't know. There's not a lot I can do about me. I am who I am. And, admittedly, we were visiting some of the more touristy areas at the time. But that limited experience has left me with a rather sour taste in my mouth whenever the prospect of visiting Spain comes up. So I say, who knows? Maybe things have changed. Maybe it was just a bad set of experiences because I was in a tourist area. Maybe Spain is just going to hate me forever and I should just get used to it. But yeah, that's why I haven't really been to Spain all that much. Although, as I said, I do intend to anyway. Rob Smith asks, a few years ago I had a poster of a sailing vessel skimming across a frozen planet, possibly a frozen sea or lake on Earth. From what I can tell, this is some artwork associated with the sci-fi book Ice Schooner. Now this made me think, did anyone ever build a ship-sized ice sailing vessel, and if so, how successful was it? I know that ice dinghies exist in more remote and frozen parts, but obviously they aren't really very big. I don't think anyone's made a kind of sailing vessel that sails on top of the ice in any kind of grand scale, at least on Earth. Interesting factoid. Apparently the idea of ice sailing vessels is a key part of Andorian history in Star Trek, but be that as it may. On Earth, the fundamental problem is that if you are a society that is mostly based living in a heavily iced area, you 99% probably don't have the resources in terms of wood and canvas and rope to build something the size of a ship. If you happen to visit those areas regularly, but not live there, then you might live in somewhere where trees actually grow and you can build a ship, but at that point you're going to find far more utility for a ship sailing in the water than in the ice. And then you run into the other problem, which is weight, which essentially is if you are going to be sailing around anywhere that you might actually want to sail through in the ice packs, whether that be north or south, the ice is only going to be up to a certain thickness. So if you build something as big and heavy as a ship, it's going to fall through the ice if you try and put it on skis or something like that. So that's not going to work. And anywhere where the ice might theoretically be thick enough to support something the size and weight of a ship, you're either talking massively deep into the ice packs, maybe like the North Pole or something, at which point, why are you even there? There's not really a lot to do, see or exploit. And the other alternative would, of course, be if you're on sort of ice pack covered ground, like Antarctica, northern Canada, but that sort of area. But at that point, being ground, it doesn't have to be even. Now, of course, ice and snow does have something of a leveling effect, but if you've ever seen any of the many nature documentaries surrounding penguins and so forth, you'll also know that the minute you get off the coastal part of Antarctica, it is not even ground. And something the size of a ship on skis, even assuming it doesn't grind its way down into the ice and snow, is going to very quickly come across terrain features it's just not going to be able to climb under sail power, if indeed it can move at all. Stefan Perot asks, am I right in assuming there are still some files relating to naval matters from the period the channel covers, which as of this day are still classified? And of these, can you say which ones you're most curious about and when they'll be probably made accessible? Well, obviously there's the files relating to the loss of HMS Glorious, which are due for release in either 2030 in about 5 years' time, or possibly 2040, depending on exactly who you believe. And I mean, to be honest, I'm more intrigued about what the heck was going on with that ship that they felt it was so important that they needed to classify it for near enough a century. I mean, heck, Bletchley Park and Ultra wasn't classified for anywhere near that long. So, yeah, I kind of want to know. But the thing is, yes, so yeah, there are still naval-related files that are classified from the time period the channel covers. But you see, the thing is, much like Bletchley Park and Ultra Decrypts and everything before they were revealed, with Glorious, we know something about it. We just know that some parts of it are hidden. The most fun files are going to be ones, probably operations and things like that, which were completely and utterly hidden and suppressed at the time. So we don't know about them. We don't know that we're missing them. And much like the Bletchley Park files, we're only going to find out about them when their classification runs out, and suddenly there'll be a whole new aspect to the war that we didn't know about. But that's only really going to start in 4 or 5 years' time, if stuff's under the 90-year rule, and, 14 to 15 years' time if anything's under the old 100-year rule. Dr. Feelgood asks, was there ever any interest in an American version of the Tone-class cruisers to take over scouting and possibly anti-submarine patrol, given the US Navy's habit of operating carriers singly? Not specifically, and there's a few reasons for that. Firstly, US carriers obviously had fairly large air wings, so scouting and ASW patrol was generally done by the VS squadrons, because, well, VS, it was the aviation scouting unit. That's exactly what they were there for. Now, to be fair, the VS squadrons were disbanded midway through the war, and the deck space distributed between the other squadrons. But at that point, you had radar, you had the Avengers in the VT squadrons being used as scouts and so forth. But if we're looking at, pre-war, firstly, the carriers were thought to carry more than enough aircraft to do those roles anyway. And secondly, although the Tones theoretically could carry up to 8 aircraft, normally they were issued with 6 and typically only really tended to sail with 4 or 5. So even if they had 5, which would have been average, you've got to remember that, as you can see here with Tone, they're just sitting out there on the back. The New Orleans class, they can carry 4. It's only 1 less than the Tones usually carried, and they can carry them in hangars. So given that the Japanese only built a couple of Tones and the US built more than a couple of New Orleans, you actually had a somewhat better scouting aircraft capability, if you needed it, using 3 or 4 New Orleans than you would with both Tone and Chikuma present. So there wasn't much of a need to build a more dedicated scouting cruiser because you had a surprising number of aircraft aboard already. And then I suppose the final thing is that occasionally in the interwar period, the US did look into the idea of, well, maybe we should have some kind of mini cruiser carrier to try and do scouting and fighter defense to take some pressure off the big fleet carriers. But when they did look into it, it was quite literally a cruiser carrier, like full flight deck and everything, with a few 8 or 6 inch gun turrets, either at one end or at both ends. So the US, when it came to scouting aircraft on cruisers, they either went full cruiser carrier in design-wise, or they just stuffed an unusually large number of scouting aircraft aboard a regular heavy cruiser and called it a day. Herr Fuschwanzager asks, follow-up question about Operation Sealion. How was the operation perceived on the German side? I imagine the public was riding high on the early victories of the Wehrmacht, but Raeder must have had a more realistic view of the Kriegsmarine's odds. And how well informed was Hitler, and how well did the coordination information exchange between different branches work? Now, obviously a lot of this does verge a little bit into the land-based history territory, so my knowledge as to what the Germans thought of Operation Sealion isn't as extensive as I'd like it to be, but from what I have read and seen, I think, well, coordination and information exchange, you're talking about the German Army, Navy and Air Force when you've got people like Goering around. Go figure, yeah, there wasn't a huge amount. Obviously there was some, but it was a bit slow and a bit like, pulling teeth. Now, when it comes to the actual landing itself, there seems to be this weird disconnect where the German army seems to have somehow convinced itself that crossing the channel was going to be just like crossing rivers. And the Kriegsmarine, basically the main thing the Kriegsmarine and the army agreed on was that you needed air superiority, which meant the Luftwaffe had to clear the skies of the RAF. And I think the army were looking at it probably from a perspective of, we know what kind of damage aircraft can do to shipping, given that, at this point Dunkirk has occurred. We don't want that to happen to our landing craft. And the Kriegsmarine are probably going, the only chance this whole thing has of working is if there's no aerial interference at all, and possibly not even then, because the Kriegsmarine were well aware of just how few ships they had to potentially escort the landings. That's why a lot of Kriegsmarine plans tend to talk about U-boats, because, well, U-boats were about the only thing they had in any great quantity at that point, even if they're singularly poor choices for guarding an invasion convoy. But to give you some idea of just how utterly insane this plan was, and the more and more I look into it, the more and more I become convinced that half the German landing force would have been killed off by the currents in the English Channel, even if the Royal Navy and the British Army didn't do anything to try and defend against it. Because, believe it or not, good chunks of the landing forces didn't have engines. And the solution from the German side of things was, yeah, we can't find enough engines to power all these barges and these flimsy little assault boats. That's okay. The ones with engines will just tow one or two of the ones that don't each. At which point everything becomes even slower and less handy, and you better hope nothing happens to the one that has the engines on it, because then 2 or 3 craft are all stuffed. But the reason I say this is an interesting little side note, because I was in part of my research for a video I want to do on Sealion, which will probably be out maybe beginning of next year as I do more and more research. I actually thought about doing a practical experiment. And I thought, okay, what if I got my hands on something that vaguely approximated one of the smaller assault craft that the Germans were going to use? Something like this Marinefahrplan's far too big for me to easily get my hands on. And then I take it to one of the prospective landing sites, or just off the coast, and then I try and see what happens in terms of trying to get ashore without an engine. So, hypothetically, something has happened to my tow. Yeah. Guess what? I was basically told, no, don't do that. For 2 reasons. Firstly, hilariously enough, these days I might be mistaken for a random illegal immigrant, although strangely enough, the illegal immigrants have better craft for crossing the channel than half the German army would have done, because they have working engines. But separate to that, I had an informal conversation with a chap from the Coast Guard, and he said, well, look, if you do get into distress, technically we do have to try and come and rescue you, but please don't, because you absolutely will get into distress. When I gave him an idea of the size and shape of the craft I wanted to use, and that I'd be starting about a mile offshore from some of the projected German landing sites on the southeast coast, and he was like, no. The wind and the currents, you're going to end up in the Straits of Dover pretty darn quickly. At which point it's going to be a race against time between whether we can find you and pull you out, or a random ship runs you down, or you smash into a cliff. So please don't. So I didn't. Yeah. It's a very silly idea, Operation Sealion. Peter Guy asks, in the age of sail, how did they handle men up in the rigging or on the yard arms when they were closing for boarding action? I imagine as they got closer to board the enemy ship that those men would have been exposed to chain shot or gunfire from Marines on deck, and thus were essentially sitting ducks. Did they leave the sails wherever they were set before closing up for boarding, or were men still up in the rigging during closing action in case they needed to furl sails, or increase and decrease the speed of the ship, etc. as they closed in? There would have been some people up there, because bear in mind you would have people in the fighting tops, or crow's nest, or whatever you want to call it. And that would be a combination of Marines and also some regular crewmen who could either shoot straight or could throw things like grenades and so on and so forth. And that was a place that people who would otherwise have been manning the sails could go. And you've also got to remember that a degree of sail management is possible from down on the deck, just not the full thing. So typically speaking, when such things are being vaguely organised, when you are closing in specifically for boarding action or close range gunnery, there usually aren't that many sailors up in the yards. There will be some, because some management of sail, even in battle, is necessary, although setting battle sail is obviously supposed to significantly reduce those numbers anyway. But there would be some men up there for some very basic maintenance and changes in sail if needed. But as I said, it wouldn't be a large number in the slightest, nowhere near the same that you'd need even to handle a single sail on a mast. And you can kind of see that because when these boarding actions happen, people are hauling up next to each other, and the number of times that somebody goes a little bit too fast or hits a little bit too violently, or there's a little bit of panic because the ship is doing something they don't want it to, and the only solution would be to do something with the sails, but they can't because there aren't enough people up there to make the rapid changes that they need. It's kind of indicative of the fact that, A, there's not many people left up there because, well, also any sailor that comes down is also a sailor who can now fight in the boarding action. But B, what few sailors are up there, by the time you're getting really close, are probably in the fighting tops, which you can kind of actually see in this illustration here. So, yeah, in theory, people could try and take pot shots to pick them off, but remember, both ships are rolling quite heavily, and, well, they'll probably be firing back, or at least they'll be standing next to people who can fire back, so they're not entirely sitting ducks. Reedy asks, a popular if only they had just for Nazi Germany is if only they had prioritised submarines. My question is, if Germany had broken the various treaties and built submarines instead of the various Deutschlands and Scharnhorst and so on, what would have been the Allies' response? By my estimation, those funny Germans building a handful of wacky ships was a much easier pill for the Allies to swallow. Yeah, when people go, oh, well, if only Germany had built submarines instead of battleships and heavy cruisers, they tend to miss, well, two big things and one smaller thing. The smaller thing is, can Germany actually afford it? Because, well, submarines still cost money. Now, granted, if you don't build the Deutschlands and the Scharnhorst and so forth, then you do have more money, but you're not going to get a Scharnhorst worth of submarines in terms of displacement for the same money. You're not going to build 35 Type 9s for the cost of a Scharnhorst, for example. You see, and you might as well build the Deutschlands because they're Weimar era ships. So, yeah, the Weimar Republic's not interested in building a massive U-boat fleet. So essentially, probably replace the Scharnhorst, the Graf Zeppelin, and the Bismarcks maybe. Now, the economics is the smaller factor. The two bigger factors is, one, the total displacement of U-boats that the Germans were supposed to build was still limited by treaty, because remember, they went from technically not being allowed to build any to being allowed to build a certain amount on the basis of the Anglo-German Naval Agreement. Now, of course, you could fudge the numbers a little bit to build a few more and then eventually abandon that. But if they just gone, stuff it, we're building as many U-boats as we like right from the get-go, then, well, that's a prompt for the Allies to go, okay, Germany's really going in heavy on the U-boat thing. Maybe we should go in quite heavy on the escort building thing. And remember, the Allies have plenty of escort designs. Now, obviously, things like the Flower-class sloop, which can be easily mass-produced, are made available right towards the end of the 1930s. But, for example, the Royal Navy is building small numbers of sloops all the way through the 1930s. And as we know, well, Johnny Walker made very good use of sloops when it came to exterminating U-boats. So even if they don't invent the Flower-class slightly early, an increase in the number of German U-boats will have the British going, okay, I guess we build more sloops then. And then they have more escorts to go with, because, well, escorts are fairly cheap. The other big thing that I think people miss is that not only is there a cost issue, there's also a resource issue, because it's all very well to look at the Scharnhorst or the Bismarcks and go, oh yeah, 32 whatever thousand tons or 42,000 tons. Imagine how many extra U-boats that could be. But even that doesn't really work, because yes, okay, if you use so many tens of thousands of tons of steel in building a battleship, you could conceivably use that steel to build U-boat hulls instead. Fine. However, U-boats need torpedoes, and torpedo tubes, and air flasks, and air pumps, and diesel motors, and electric motors, and batteries, and things like this. And you might be saying, okay, Drac, but what's your point? Well, my point is, most of those things don't exist on battleships, and plenty of things that are on battleships, like socking great heavy artillery guns and steam turbine engines and boilers and all of this kind of stuff, anti-aircraft fire control systems, the central fire control computers for the main battery and so forth, those don't exist on U-boats either. And this isn't like some kind of RTS where you can go to, generic engine factory A and go, okay, I'm going to cancel my order for steam turbines and I'm just going to get you to build a ton of smaller, cheaper diesel engines and electric motors. It doesn't work that way. You have factories which can build turbines. You have factories which can build diesels. You have factories which can build electric motors. You have factories that can build batteries. And they all have capacities. And if you say, okay, I'm not going to build steam turbines for battleships anymore, that doesn't increase your ability to build diesels and electric motors. The diesel factories and the electric motors still have exactly the same capacity limits. Just because you cancelled the turbines from the turbine factory doesn't make any difference to that. You're not going to get, if you cancel the Scharnhorst and the Bismarcks, there is no way on this planet you're going to get another 150, 160 U-boats out of it. A lot's going to be dependent on those manufacturing caps for different components that go into those U-boats, but I'd be shocked if over the same time period you would get more than 60 or 70. And that's probably being generous. And as I say, if Germany starts building a ton of U-boats and no capital ships, it's a big red flag to all the Allies to start building escorts. Andre de Coult asks, in the age of steam and steel, were there any warship design choices made based purely, or mostly, on aesthetic considerations? And if yes, could you please give us a couple of examples? Yeah, there were a few. Bow ornaments, for example, as you can see here, those continued well into the age of steam and steel, even though by World War I they were being removed, and definitely were removed for wartime. But you look through the latter part of the 19th and very early 20th centuries, and there's some really elaborate bow work going on, and to a degree some stern work as well. Weirdly enough, I think the uncrowned kings of the elaborate bow ornamentation were probably the US Navy in the 1890s and early 1900s. Some choices surrounding the superstructures as well were at least partly based on aesthetic considerations. Now, there was a degree of practicality there as well, but when you look through the various design notes, there are references quite often to small changes to either keep the general look and feel of the ship aggressive or in keeping with the national character or the national spirit and various other things like this. Now, obviously, that doesn't really work in all cases, but especially in the pre-carrier era, when you look at the location and shaping of some ships, forward superstructures and so forth, you can kind of tell that while there is a lot of practicality to it, there's also definitely been some decisions about exactly how the ship should look to intimidate people. And of course, the paint job, up until everybody went grey, pure white for the Great White Fleet, or the black, white and buff of the Royal Navy, and so on and so forth, that's purely aesthetics designed to make you look good. And occasionally there are attempts to either hold on to a design feature or advocate for a new one, partly or wholly on the basis of aesthetics, but the effort doesn't work. So, for example, when the British in World War I are moving from the cruiser or clipper style bow, very heavily flared bow, over to the knuckle or trawler bow, which you'll see in the later World War I and then interwar and World War II ships, there is actually some discussion amongst the more conservative, traditionally minded naval officers where they're like, oh, no, we don't like it. We think it ruins the lines of the ship. And we'd really rather you didn't, despite the fact that it's a purely practical choice designed to enhance the performance of ships. But some people just like, I don't like the look of it, therefore it shouldn't happen. They get overruled, though. Eric Van Dooting asks, in the run-up to the Second London Naval Conference, was there ever any attempt by the Japanese Army or the pro-treaty faction of the Navy to team up to try and get Japan to be a signatory to Second London under the logic that a continuation of the treaty limits for the Navy might mean more money was available for the Army, and the Army had significant political power in Japan at that point? No, there doesn't seem to have been such an attempt. The Japanese government as a whole, and the Navy for the most part, had by late 34, early 35, decided that it just wasn't in their interest to stick with the treaty system, to the point that they'd essentially told their delegation, including obviously at that point Admiral Yamamoto, that while they didn't want to kind of lose face by being seen to be the ones to throw the entire international order of naval regulation into the air if it could be avoided, they were prepared to accept that fate if it had to be that way. But essentially, they gave Yamamoto and the negotiating party orders to scuttle the whole conference, basically to make such ridiculous demands like the complete scrapping of aircraft carriers and the complete scrapping of capital ships, and then whiplash back to Japan being given an equal standing with the US and the Royal Navy. Basically, their instructions were, well, if by some method you can persuade everybody to do a 5-5-5, so Japan becomes equal in size to the Royal and US Navies, then fine, we'll obey that treaty. But otherwise, basically just throw a bunch of unreasonable demands out there and then say, well, if you're not going to meet any of our demands, then we're gone. The government was fully committed to getting Japan out of the treaty system before the conference even started. Adam Eck asks, who built the 5-inch 38 guns? Was there a primary manufacturer, or were plans provided to each shipyard for production? The shipyards themselves didn't produce the guns. What would happen is, well, in this case, the guns were developed by the US Navy and by the broader US Department of Defense, but then the plans, because they needed so many of them, were supplied to all sorts of companies. Obviously a mixture of in-house manufacturing by the US Navy, but also private gun and ordnance manufacturing companies, and also private steel companies, because sometimes you'd have companies like Bethlehem Steel, which technically were mainly concerned with the production of actual steel, but had kind of branched out to include things like ship production and gun production and so on and so forth, much like Vickers and Armstrong in the UK. And so when it comes to who built the 5-inch 38, it's more a question of who didn't build 5-inch 38s. If you get a chance to look at the various 5-inch 38s on preserved museum ships and so forth, you'll find there's over a dozen major companies were all building them at various times during World War II. Gabriel A. Hawkins asks, I've always been fascinated by the Porter incident, that's USS William D. Porter, mostly because I have a penchant for being embroiled in seemingly impossible screw-ups that are a product of being in the wrong place at the wrong time rather than malfeasance. Perhaps out of empathy, I'm bemused at what I believe to be a blatant overreaction by the Navy. Extremely long court-martials, quarantine crews, Iowa training her guns on the ship, etc. Did the Navy really think that the ship was up to no good, rather than a mistakenly launched torpedo being a product of, well, a mistake? And is there any component of the Navy's reaction that strikes you as sane? Have torpedoes accidentally been fired in other notable incidents? Yeah, the poor old William D. Porter is one of those odd cases where there's a huge amount of legends built up around her. And fortunately or unfortunately, depending on how you want to look at it, a good chunk of it is actually not correct. I did actually do a video a little while back on the channel about the William D. Porter, where I tried to pick through and point out, which bits were true and which bits were not about the commonly held legends about the ship. And the funny thing is that some parts which would seem relatively mundane in the overall story as it's told in pop culture, like, scraping down the side of another ship in dock, which, it adds to the unluckiness of the ship, but ultimately that kind of thing is a relatively day-to-day screw-up. It's happened quite a lot of times, but in William D. Porter's case, there's no evidence for it at all. So it doesn't seem to have happened, as in, there's not a log for the Porter doing it, the ship it supposedly hit doesn't record any incident, and the harbour doesn't record any such incidents during the time the ship was in port. So it's a weird thing to throw in there on the basis of, there doesn't seem to be any evidence at all for that. But then you have much bigger things like accidentally firing a torpedo at USS Iowa while the president of the US is aboard. Now, that is the kind of extremely dramatic, over-the-top thing you think someone clearly did add to the account or embellish, but no, actually, legitimately, the destroyer did accidentally fire a torpedo at the USS Iowa while Franklin D. Roosevelt was aboard. And it runs the gamut in between. Quite a lot of it is, there's a kernel of truth to what is said, but the claims then get somewhat overblown. So for a full examination, I'd suggest looking up that video. And that gives you a more nuanced idea of the Navy's reaction to things as well. But, you get the sense when you're looking through the various documents that the Navy was kind of taking an approach of, okay, once is an accident, twice is suspicious, three times there's enemy action. Although Porter doesn't get up to quite the level of shenanigans that pop culture wants her to, she does get up to enough shenanigans that certainly towards the end of her career, the Navy's going, either this is a spectacularly unlucky ship, or something's up with this. And they're getting more, they're side-eyeing her more and more as time goes on. In terms of torpedoes accidentally being fired, there are semi-regular occurrences of accidental torpedo firings in one way, shape or form or another over time in naval history. Okay, firing a torpedo at a fast-moving battleship with your president aboard, I don't think anyone's quite managed that level of spectacularness. But there have been a few rather close calls at somewhat more mundane levels, and also accidental torpedo tube firings, even if the torpedo wasn't in there. For example, in the aftermath of Pearl Harbor, I believe it was a submarine that was undergoing maintenance, if I remember correctly, in my US Pacific Fleet submarine warfare videos. And somebody accidentally discharged the pressurized torpedo tube, again, fortunately without a torpedo, which caused no small degree of upset, given how twitchy Pearl Harbor was in the aftermath of December 7th. JT Daily Update asks, instead of using the unrotated projectile launcher as an ineffective anti-aircraft weapon, would it be possible to redesign it as an anti-submarine weapon? And if so, how much effort would be required to do so? And how effective would it be compared to Hedgehog? It's certainly possible to redesign the system. A much cut-down version was named Land Mattress and used as a rocket launcher system on both converted landing craft and on land by the Army. But there would be a few problems, I think. If you're using the navalized UP launchers, like you can see here, well, they're considerably bigger and heavier than Hedgehogs, which would be a problem on small escorts. I think you'd probably have to, if you were a flower class or something, you'd probably have to sacrifice something of the order of something like the 4-inch forward deck gun to fit them. Now, granted, they're somewhat long range, so you could perhaps fit them aft, so you could keep your 4-inch deck gun, but on smaller escorts, I think you'd be hard-pressed to find a place for them. Maybe on something like a River-class frigate or something, you could fit one. Unless, of course, you took the land mattress approach, but then the problem with the land mattress approach is the cut-down, 2-ton launcher, or 1 to 2-ton launcher, is that you've then got to deal with a rocket backblast. Whereas, as you can see here with the big plate underneath, part of the navalized UP system is, well, there's a plate underneath to deal with the rocket backblast, which Hedgehog doesn't have to deal with. Another issue is that except for one variant on the rockets that were used from the UP system, pretty much all of them have about the same warhead size as a Hedgehog when they're using high explosive warheads and not aerial mines. And that means you haven't got any more effective firepower than a Hedgehog. And even the heaviest high explosive rocket used in the system is still only double a Hedgehog, so it's still nowhere close to being depth charge level, which means you're still going to be needing a skin-skin contact. And at that point, what you've got is a bigger, heavier, more cumbersome, much more difficult to reload, much more dangerous to the ship Hedgehog. The only advantage you'd have is that this system could fire out to quite a few thousand yards, whereas obviously Hedgehog is a much shorter range system. So there's, in theory, that possibility of being able to conduct somewhat longer range engagements against U-boats, but then that would be dependent on you getting an accurate enough fix, because remember, this isn't an accurate enough fix to lob a depth charge in its general vicinity. You'd be looking at an accurate enough fix to salvo a bunch of these rockets and hope that you got a direct skin-skin contact, which, yeah, at 6,000-7,000 yards, I'm not betting on that. By the time you get close enough, you're probably almost in Hedgehog range anyway. Now, towards the end of the war, as sonar systems are getting somewhat better, there may be a certain amount of utility in that, but then by that point you have things like Limbo and Squid being developed, which can throw much heavier explosives and thus have a depth charge effect rather than needing a direct hit. So honestly, I don't think it would be worth it. But if you were to stick UP launchers as some kind of anti-submarine weapon on escorts for some reason, I think probably their greatest utility would be at short to medium range against surface U-boats, and particularly because obviously they're quite high mounted, they can point down at very close range against surface U-boats, because, I mean, they carry a fair amount of boom, so rather than have to rely on a deck gun, which a U-boat can theoretically surface within the range of, and also obviously only has a certain rate of fire because there's only one barrel, and then you're down to your AA guns. In that kind of niche circumstance of submarine detected on the surface and we need to dump a bunch of firepower into ASAP, well, yeah, at that point dumping a couple of dozen UP rockets with 30 to 60 pounds of explosive would do a real number on the sub, but that's a very niche circumstance to carry a fairly chunky weapon. Sebastian asks, are there still crewmen buried aboard the Admiral Scheer? And if so, why is its resting place not considered a war grave or war memorial? So according to what I could find, there weren't that many crew aboard the ship when she was bombed. She was in dock for repairs, and the vast majority of the crew were actually already off the ship. They'd been given leave. And then when the air raid sirens started, most of what was left aboard, most of the crew that were aboard, decided to leave and went to bunkers, which was what they'd been told to do, air raid bunkers. So there are only 90 or so people aboard when she started taking hits. And the majority of them survived, and they brought a number of unconscious, or as it turned out in some cases, dead crewmen with them. And then, of course, she settled like this, as you can see in the picture, upturned, but a good chunk of her out of the water. And rescue parties did actually cut into the hull and spend some time looking for survivors and presumably recovered one or two bodies. Now, again, according to the best sources I could find, there are probably around 15 crewmen who were unaccounted for once all was said and done, who are therefore probably still in there somewhere in the heart of the ship. However, that was the immediate post-war reckoning. Between the end of the war and when she was covered over and turned into a car park, there was further salvage work done to the ship, including quite a bit of stripping down. Whether or not they came across the remains of the 15 men who were left aboard the ship at that point isn't recorded. If they did, then obviously there would be no reason for the Scheer to be considered a war grave or war memorial because there would be nobody aboard. If they didn't, and I don't know what exactly was recovered or not recovered during those salvage operations, then in theory it could be considered a war grave or war memorial, but then you also have to factor in that it's ultimately a ship of the Kriegsmarine, and Germany is not particularly keen on making big ceremonial war memorials for Nazi troops. And I mean, ultimately they turned the thing into a car park, which tells you exactly what they thought of the wreck at the time. So in terms of whether it should perhaps now have a small memorial or something, well, that's obviously a question for the German government, and also, as I said, a question for potentially more research into the post-war salvage efforts and whether or not the bodies of those who are known to have been lost with the ship were recovered, and therefore whether it actually is a war grave or not. Yokosuka Girls Marine High School training vessel Harakaze asks, my next-door neighbour has a son, a Muslim, who is soon to join the Royal Navy as a trainee at the Britannia Royal Naval College. Now, this got me wondering, in all the tales of adventure and daring in the history of the Royal Navy, almost always the officers are white and Christian. Could you give a few notable examples of non-white and non-Christian officers in the period the Channel covers? In the period the Channel covers, you're going to be looking at fairly slim pickings if you want to look at officers. There are actually quite a few, in fact, a fairly wide variety of non-white sailors, a fair number of whom achieved fairly famous deeds. I mean, one of the earliest Royal Navy recipients of the Victoria Cross was a black Royal Navy sailor during the Indian Mutiny. But if you're looking specifically at officers, you've got to remember that the officer corps of the Royal Navy, even in the time period the Channel covers, when the Royal Navy is substantially larger than it is now, is still a relatively small group of people. You're looking at maybe low tens of thousands maximum out of a population of millions, with something of a bent towards existing naval families and middle class, upper middle class, and aristocracy. Although there are meritocratic promotions as well. And on top of that, as compared to today, the non-white population of the UK, which is where most Royal Navy officers were sourced from, was considerably lower as a proportion than it is these days. And yes, there were obviously Royal Navy officers from places like Canada and so forth, but again, in even lower numbers. So while it was absolutely not unusual to see non-white sailors aboard a Royal Navy ship in the Napoleonic period or the 19th century, an officer was an entirely different matter simply because of, well, the selection bias and the relatively low proportion of them in the pool of people from which the Royal Navy generally drew its officers. That said, there were a few non-white officers in the Royal Navy. Generally, the one who's credited as being the first confirmed non-white officer would be John Perkins, who was a mixed-race Jamaican officer who rose from basically being a ship's boy all the way up to being a captain in the Napoleonic Wars, and seems to have done relatively well for himself persecuting the French, capturing a fair number of ships. Exactly how many depends on your source, but he captured at least 100 enemy trade vessels, so he's pretty darn good at his job. And yes, I know it's very stereotypical, but the idea of a Royal Navy schooner or brig's command section sounding more like the set of Cool Runnings than what we traditionally think of it while in the middle of terrorizing French shipping is highly amusing to me. But if you're looking for concrete examples of non-Christian officers in the time period the Channel covers, I think you're going to struggle quite a bit, because for the vast majority of the time period the Channel covers, being a non-Christian was a good way to get yourself executed, or at least very heavily imprisoned if you're looking further back into the older age of sail. And while you could notionally express atheistic beliefs or non-Christian beliefs in sort of the late 18th, early 19th century and onwards, you'd still be something of a social pariah. So, yeah, getting an officer's appointment is going to be very, very difficult. And to be honest, sailors are a superstitious lot, especially back then. And if you had a either non-believing or differently believing officer on a ship in that time period, I think you'd find an awful lot of the crew would be very unenthusiastic about having you aboard, simply because they'd see it as bad luck. Would invite divine retribution for having a heathen on board, that kind of stuff. And even once you get into the late 19th and early 20th century, where the Channel's period of coverage ends, it's still societally very much frowned upon not to profess some form of Christian belief, especially in something like a Royal Navy profession. So, I mean, when you look at records from World War II, for example, you do see examples of sailors trying to hide from having to go to the chaplain service every Sunday, etc., because they either don't believe generally or they don't believe in the particular denomination that the chaplain is preaching. But the ship's officers will be there every Sunday to set an example, both for the rest of the sailors and for their own social standing, regardless of what beliefs they may personally hold. And of course, one, those kinds of records aren't really generally recorded at the time, and two, obviously I focus more on the technical side of history. So, as I said, there are some examples of non-white officers you could look at. If you want to look at non-Christian officers, at least those who would admit to such a thing, you're probably out of luck when it comes to pre-1950s Royal Navy. I mean, there undoubtedly probably were some, but any record of that is scarce at best. HMS Albatross asks, "Hi Drac, I noticed in Friedman's The British Battleship 1906 to 1946 there are a number of statistics given for some of the battle cruisers that puzzle me. On page 313, Queen Mary doesn't have a trial speed given, but is said to have produced 75,000 shaft horsepower in order to reach 28 knots while displacing 27,000 tons. Later, on page 335, Tiger's trial speed on normal load is given as 28.39 knots, producing 91,105 shaft horsepower. And then on page 452, Repulse's trial speed is mentioned at 32.8 knots, producing 126,300 shaft horsepower while displacing 27,900 tons. Now, I understand Tiger's displacement being given at around 28,500 tons. Now, if this is accurate, Tiger, which is a few feet longer and around 1,500 tons heavier, needs just over 16,000 more shaft horsepower to maintain or improve on Queen Mary's speed by a fraction of a knot. However, Repulse, which is about 90 feet longer and about 600 tons lighter, achieves nearly 4 more knots with an increase of 35,195 shaft horsepower. Can a much better length-to-beam ratio and 600 tons really allow for that kind of increase in speed? So I think there's two things in play. Firstly, length-to-beam ratio can make a huge difference to the amount of power you need for a given amount of speed. But more generally, there's the issue that, as you said, in Friedman's book, you can't find any specific records of Queen Mary's trial speed and therefore her trial power output. And the thing you've got to remember is that the ships have a design speed and a design power output, but on trials they often push the machinery much further than the design power output, essentially to see how far they can push it and how fast you can go. And Tiger actually also had a little bit of a unique sort of design requirement built in there as well. So I did a little bit of digging, and I eventually pulled up my copy of Battlecruisers by John Roberts, and that actually has a lot more details, which I think will probably help things make a bit more sense. So I'm going to quote verbatim because, well, I can't really improve on that information. So here we go. And this does also show how much propellers and where you do your trials can make a difference. So, Queen Mary carried out her steam trials during May and June 1913. The full power measured mile being run on the 2nd of June. With closed exhaust, she made 28.17 knots with 83,003 shaft horsepower as a mean of 4 runs. Tiger's contract specified a high power of 85,000 shaft horsepower for a speed of 28 knots. the builders not being held responsible for the results of the designed overload power of 108,000 shaft horsepower for 30 knots, either in performance or mechanical failure. The trials were run after the outbreak of war in October 1914, when she made 28.38 knots with 91,103 shaft horsepower on her contractor's measured mile trials and 29.07 knots with 104,635 shaft horsepower on overload. Although the latter fell short of expectations, and it was thought she would do better in deep water, she did not achieve the required shaft revolutions, which was hoped could be improved by fitting new propellers. It was proposed to modify her spare propellers by cutting off 4 inches from the tips of each blade, reducing the area by 2 square feet and rebalancing them, orders being sent to Devonport for this to be done. There does not appear to be any record of subsequent trials, and it seems likely that the delay in her joining the fleet was not considered acceptable. It is also not clear if her modified spare propellers were ever fitted. The problems of uncertain speed figures in shallow water were avoided in the case of Renown and Repulse by laying out a special measured mile course for them in the deep water off the Isle of Arran in the Firth of Clyde. Repulse was tried on this course during a 4-hour full-power run on August 1916 on her way south to Portsmouth. However, while there are records of these results, for the full run there do not seem to be any figures recorded for the measured mile, apart from a note to the effect that she achieved about 125,000 shaft horsepower. She carried out a more extensive progressive measured mile run on the Arran course on her way north to join the fleet in September, and at full power made 31.725 knots with 118,913 shaft horsepower. Although below her design speed of 32 knots, the ship was 3,400 tons in excess of her design load displacement, and the wind was blowing at force 5 to 6 at the start of the trials and force 8 toward the end. It was estimated that at load draft and with 120,000 shaft horsepower, the ship would achieve 32.5 knots. As if to prove the point, Renown made 32.58 knots, but this was with 126,300 shaft horsepower and with a displacement only 1,400 tons in excess of load draft. So, essentially, the power and speed results for Queen Mary and Tiger on their trials actually pushed things somewhat closer together. Repulse obviously having a much better length to beam ratio and more power is unsurprisingly a lot faster, but there's also that specific mention of the fact that Tiger's trials are run in shallow water and with perhaps less than optimal propellers. So the fact that Tiger needs considerably more power to barely exceed Queen Mary's speed isn't perhaps that surprising in that specific circumstance. And if Tiger was ever given corrected propellers and run in deeper water, she probably would have either gone considerably quicker with the same power or been able to match Queen Mary's speed at approximately the same power levels. And in some ways, this is actually a very, very good example as to how, obviously, in this case, the Royal Navy isn't trying to cheat trials tests, but they are running into problems based on the location. But it shows how you can kind of cheat trials tests if you very specifically select a particular depth of water, for instance, which might give you something of an advantage in gaining speed, which will give an impression that the ship can go faster than actually can in more regular service. If the gods had meant us to be happy, they would have given us a honey-based alcoholic beverage. Oh Look Mead asks, I recently-ish watched the Operations Room's video on Operation Pedestal. It's a very good series, actually, and I need to do my own Malta Convoys videos at some point in the future. Anyway, and some of the Royal Navy destroyer captains seem to be raving lunatics with their sights set firmly on command of tribal-class destroyers or a seat in Valhalla, or both. Not that they would seemingly stop the chase of the latter just because they obtained command of the former. Were Royal Navy destroyer captains generally disconcerted with their own death as long as they didn't go out alone, or did the Admiralty just have their pick of madmen for Operation Pedestal? Royal Navy destroyer captains generally tended to be more of the lunatically aggressive berserker types almost all the time. and that's because the Royal Navy tended to employ a little bit of a filtering process when it came to who was going to be assigned where. So in the pre-war period, the interwar period, the Royal Navy had a whole slew of different sizes of destroyers. You had obviously the big tribals coming in towards the end, and some of the other classes immediately surrounding it, like the J's and the K's. You had the more regular fleet destroyers that tended to have the 4.7-inch guns, and then you had a lot of World War I holdovers, S-class, V&W class, etc. And the V&Ws were still around in World War II for the most part. So what the Royal Navy would tend to do if you were a young and up-and-coming officer is that you would, as one of your earliest kind of command-level experiences, be assigned as the first or executive officer, depending on what parlance you want to use, depending on what country you're in, of a destroyer, usually a smaller one, so an S-class or a V&W. You would then be assessed by the Navy and by the officer in charge of the ship as to what your temperament was like. And the Royal Navy actually had some official and a lot of unofficial guidelines as to what kind of temperaments were best suited for battleships, cruisers, carriers, submarines, and destroyers. And they tended to prefer the more free-thinking and berserkly aggressive officers for the destroyers. So, and they also had a good idea of, who would be good as an officer, but as part of the chain of command, and who would be good as an officer at the top of the chain of command, i.e. who would make a good captain, who would make a good admiral, who would make a good XO, who would make a good head of department, etc. So at that stage, if they thought, this guy might be a good destroyer officer, he might be suited elsewhere, then you might be given command as a lieutenant or a lieutenant commander of a smaller destroyer like an S-class or a V&W. And if you were definitely considered command material for destroyers, you'd be put on a fleet destroyer, so one of the Alphabet series, and then latterly tribals and so forth. So if you were given command of one of the bigger destroyers, you'd probably already been assessed by the Royal Navy as slightly psychologically unstable. And if you're given command of one of the smaller ones, they're like, you might be mad, you might not be, you might just be good at hiding it, we don't know yet. So, yeah. And then from that pool, the real lunatics, the ones who probably should be stored in asylums when war isn't on, they were given command of the tribals. And yeah, there were a few tribals on Operation Pedestal, unsurprisingly. So, yeah, you don't want to get in the way of a Royal Navy destroyer captain when he's decided he's found a target. They were quite literally specially selected for the job. But you've also got to remember there was something of a psychological effect going on with Pedestal as well, because for a good chunk of the war up till this point, you did have very aggressive Royal Navy destroyer captains. You can cite a whole laundry list of examples. But that was with a kind of a sword of Damocles hanging over their head of a lot of the time being told either you are the only forces in the area or you are part of a relatively small contingent of the overall Navy in the area. So dial it in a bit because we can't really afford to lose that many destroyers. With Pedestal, you look at the forces deployed as an escort, Pedestal was one of the largest deployments of Royal Navy strength in one place during the entire first half of the Second World War. And there's a certain psychology that goes with seeing that kind of deployment. And for Royal Navy destroyer captains, essentially what went through a lot of their minds was, oh, good. There's enough of us that if my ship gets badly hit in the defense of the convoy, it's not going to matter quite as much as it would on a regular convoy where I might be one of 3 or 4 escort ships total, let alone destroyers. Here we've got several dozen, so I can afford to be, as aggressive as I actually have wanted to be all this time, plus all the pent-up frustration from not being as aggressive as they'd wanted to be in all this previous time. And that's how you get things like HMS Quinton, whose captain really should have had one of those trireme beating drums going because he saw an Italian submarine and he was just like, ramming speed! It's like, you have guns, you have depth charges. He's like, no, ram the thing. This is how I enjoy myself. Yeah. And you actually see examples of this psychological effect across the entirety of World War II for navies that actually have fairly large fleets. I mean, if you read US sailors' accounts from, for example, the Marshall and Gilbert's campaign, the first big US counterstrike, there's diaries from US sailors that basically say, yeah, yes, we fought Coral Sea and Midway and Guadalcanal and, Eastern Solomons and Santa Cruz, but there was always this sense of a bit of a patchwork thrown together fleet that was mostly about trying to stop the Japanese making further advances, whereas as the fleet built up for the Gilbert and Marshall's operation, they're like, ooh, troop ships, battleships, multiple carriers, cruisers and destroyers, as far as the eye can see. This is a fleet. We're really back in the game now. And that encouraged their aggressiveness as well. And to be honest, this kind of group psychology in a combat situation, I can attest to even in a very, very small way. Because, if I'm doing reenactment, medieval reenactment, for example, if I'm doing a 1v1 combat display or, a small group of us, maybe 2 or 3, you feel quite protected in your armor and you're fairly confident in your skills and everything. But there is a certain amount of caution going in because, well, you could be mobbed, you could be surrounded, and you're very conscious of the fact there's only one of you or only 2 or 3 of you. Whereas once you get, half a dozen of you or a whole formation and you're part of that and everyone's like, yeah, let's go, you feel pretty much invincible. Your confidence levels go through the roof, your aggression levels go through the roof. And this is why drill and keeping formation is so important, because otherwise you would have a bunch of people just going, yeah, come on then, let's go, and screaming off into the distance. Now, apply that to, as I said, a bunch of possibly mildly psychologically unstable destroyer captains, and, I'm surprised they weren't out there with swords and pikes trying to stab German pilots out of the air. 3 Papa asks, what radar picket station was the USS Hobson manning when she was hit by a kamikaze off Okinawa? I recently learned about picket stations 1 through 15 on the Unauthorized History of the Pacific War podcast, and I was hoping they would mention Hobson, but they didn't. So I think I was able to find the station through the power of deduction. I wasn't able to find any easy direct references to Hobson and her particular radar picket station, but I was able to find reference to the fact that Hobson had been sent to a picket station to replace the USS Manat El Abele, which had been sunk by kamikazes, including an early use of the Oka-specific kamikaze missile. And when I looked through the records of the Manat El Abele, she was on radar patrol station number 14 when she was hit by the kamikazes. So, therefore, in theory, if the Hobson was sent out to replace the Abele and was sent to that specific station, obviously, which makes logical sense, then she would have been on radar picket station number 14 at the time that she was hit. Bruce Kiernan asks, you've repeatedly emphasized just how bad the Japanese 25mm light AA weapon was. How did it compare to the US 1.1-inch Chicago piano? And did the Japanese ever look into getting a better weapon? It's an interesting comparison, actually. Both guns fire their shells at about the same muzzle velocity, although the US shell is somewhat heavier. And in terms of advantages for the Japanese, that mostly consists of the fact that the Japanese mounts are proportionally lighter. The 1.1-inch, one of its major downsides was it was an incredibly heavy mounting for what it gave you. But that's really about it. The Chicago piano could elevate past 90 degrees, which meant you could use it with much more utility against dive bombers coming in at high angles, although Vals didn't tend to do that usually. Also, although the notional rate of fire of the 1.1-inch is lower than the notional rate of fire of the 25mm, because of the limitations of the 25mm and the slow changing of the box magazines, the actual rate of fire of the 1.1-inch is higher than the actual effective rate of fire in rounds per minute of the 25mm. The 1.1 inch is also somewhat faster to traverse and elevate, slow traverse and elevation speeds being a noted problem with the 25mm, and it is also a more accurate weapon. The vibration issues with the 25mm making it somewhat inaccurate, bit of a spray and pray type weapon. The only other real advantage that the 25mm has over the 1.1 inch is that while the 25mm is slow to elevate and difficult to reload and fairly inaccurate, the one thing it doesn't tend to do is jam. The big problem with the 1.1 inch was consistent jamming. Now, there were some mitigation factors they could do against the jamming of the 1.1 inch, but ultimately it was still, even after improvements, a somewhat jam-prone, as I said, extremely heavy mounting, which is why the Bofors and the 20mm displaced it, because you could get more 20mm that didn't jam for the same weight, or you could get a couple of Bofors for the same weight, and the Bofors was a much more effective gun. As far as the Japanese looking for a better light AA weapon, they did have a few different possible alternatives in the light to medium anti-aircraft department, but their main problem, to be perfectly honest, was the fact that, well, they had a big production line set up for the 25mm, and unlike the US, which was able to pivot over to the Orkan 20 and the Bofors 40 pretty quickly, and to be honest was already starting that process while they were technically in peacetime, the Japanese never really identified something that they could build in mass numbers before wartime demands started to catch up with them, at which point, like most things manufactured in World War II, it was a case of, we can build this in large numbers, therefore we will, rather than potentially betting the entire house on something that might not work and would need a bit of a wind-up time to produce anyway. Robert Ohlweiler asks, why was the firing cycle on US standard battleships so long, especially compared to their British and Japanese contemporaries? I can understand the Germans were a little bit ahead because they used brass and sliding breech blocks, etc., but I can't find a reason why the 14 and 16-inch standards took about 15 to 20 seconds longer than the Queen Elizabeths, Fusos, and Nagatos, etc. Was there a significant design feature not present in other people's battleships that caused the delay? There's actually quite an interesting one, and it comes down to two factors. For some of the earlier US standards, when you look at the 14-inch gun mountings, if you start with the New Yorks, which are technically just before the standards, but then you progress from the New Yorks through the Nevadas, Pennsylvanias, etc., you kind of see a stop motion of power loading being introduced into the US Navy's battleships. So the New Yorks have a lot of manual work to do in loading their guns. Then the Nevadas start to introduce a degree of power loading, and then more and more power loading comes in as the standards progress. So that's a small factor by the time of the full standards, like the Pennsylvanias and so forth. The much bigger factor, though, is that British and Japanese guns in World War I were designed to load at any angle of elevation, which basically translates to up to about 20 degrees in the majority of the 1910s. The US guns, on the other hand, were designed only to be loaded when they were flat level. So that meant that, in theory, if you had to elevate your guns to, let's say, 15 degrees to shoot at an enemy that's a reasonable distance away, if you were a British or a Japanese ship, you fired your guns, and then as soon as the recoil had stopped, you could just start opening up the breeches, commence the loading cycle, and then, close everything up again. There'd be a minor adjustment to elevation, obviously, because the target will have moved very slightly, and then they could fire again. So your reloading cycle essentially consisted of how long does it take you to open the breech and get new ammunition in, plus how long does it take for the minor corrections for elevation and training, because obviously, as we said, the target is moving. Whereas for the US guns at the time, it would be a case of, okay, we've fired at our target, now we have to lower the guns down to flat level, then we can reload them, then we have to elevate the guns all the way back up again to 15 degrees in this example, and then we have to make the fine adjustments for training and elevation that the fire control system says. And that adds 10 to 15 seconds to your loading time, which is why the firing cycle on the US standards in World War I is quite long. Now, there are two interesting things. Apart from a handful of nations like the French, once you get into the interwar and World War II period, the nations that had previously been going, oh yeah, we can load at 20 degrees or whatever, they actually scaled that back down to loading at much less ambitious angles, like maybe up to about 5 degrees. And the US advanced from loading at basically flat to loading at up to 5 degrees. So the US fast battleships load at 5 degrees, including the Iowas, which incidentally, someone asked me this question a while back, if you watch videos of the Iowas firing from the 80s and so forth, you'll notice that as soon as they fire, the guns start to drop. And that's simply because, well, the gun has fired at a reasonable elevation. It can't load it or reload at that elevation. It has to come back down to a minimum angle for reloading. Now, with all that said, there were some limitations compared to the technical capabilities on paper of the British and Japanese guns. What they tended to find was that, yes, you could load at fairly different angles, but if you tried to elevate the guns up to 15, 20, let's say 20 degrees, the maximum elevation, at those higher elevations, they did have problems with the hydraulic rammers and so forth, and chain rammers, not really quite actually being strong enough to shove the shell into place and so forth, which could be inconvenient, or if you didn't manage to get a bite on the driving band, very entertaining, because then you'd withdraw the rammer and the shell would come with you, which would be fun. So, although in theory you could aim the guns up at 20 degrees and reload them at that angle, in practice it tended to be a case of, well, we're going to have to lower them down a little bit to be safe, so let's say maybe 10 degrees. Now, while that is a limitation compared to their on-paper capabilities, it still saves an awful lot of time compared to the US guns. So, for example, if you're engaging in a very long-range firefight and your guns are up at 20 degrees, assuming you can elevate them to 20 degrees, then if you're a British or a Japanese ship, if you can safely reload at, say, 10 degrees quite consistently, then that might take 5 or 6 seconds either way, going up and going down, whereas, as I said, for the US guns, that might take 10, 11 seconds going either way. So it still saves time. Matt Blom asks, is it possible to briefly describe an approximation of a typical British sailor's day on a battleship in the age of steam and steel, perhaps during World War I to be specific? I've always wondered what time a sailor would typically wake up, how much of their day would be drill or downtime, how long a typical watch would be, when they retire for the day, assuming there's not an immediate threat of battle. So World War I's a rather interesting one, actually, because the Royal Navy is in the middle of transitioning between watches at that point. And I don't mean the wristwatch thing, I mean the actual watches that you stand every day. They're previously, their holdover from the Napoleonic period, actually, the Royal Navy had been operating a 2-watch system, and they were basically being prodded by some more far-thinking officers into adopting a 3-watch system. But when you'd wake up would depend on what watches you were assigned. And the thing was, everything was staggered so that you weren't doing exactly the same watches every day, because that would mean the really unpopular watches would get manned by the same people every day, and that would get very unpopular very quickly. So in the Royal Navy, they actually have a very consistent set of actual watches. It just depends on what cycle you stand them. So you have first watch, which is 8 p.m. to midnight. Middle watch, midnight to 4 a.m. So these are 4-hour watches. Morning watch, 4 a.m. to 8 a.m. Forenoon watch, 8 a.m. to noon. Afternoon watch, noon to 4. And then the last period between 4 and 8 p.m. is split into first and last dog watches. And those 2-hour breaks, or 2-hour watches, are designed to form the break. Because if you had 6 watches, and obviously under the traditional system you're doing 1 on, 1 off, 1 on, 1 off, then you'd obviously end up doing exactly the same thing all the time. Whereas with an odd number of watches, whatever system you use, you are going to end up cycling through those watches. So you might be waking up just before 4 a.m. if you're assigned to the morning watch. You might be waking up at midnight if you're assigned to the middle watch, and so on and so forth. So under the then new 1 in 3 watch system, if you woke up for 3:30, let's say, to get on station for 4 a.m., so you had the morning watch, so you do your morning watch, and then your next watch would be the dog watch, the first dog, and then after that you go through to, and then you'd be on the middle watch, so that'd be midnight. So then you'd be going to bed at 4 instead of on station at 4, and then you'd be up at noon, and so on and so forth as time goes round. And then obviously factored into that, you have breakfast and cleaning the ship, training, etc. And then you have the fact that you might be standing defense watches if people think an encounter with the enemy is likely. So then you'd be doing 6 hours on, 6 hours off. So the ship is ready and primed for action at all times. So, yeah, there isn't really such a thing as a typical day, unfortunately. But what I can do is quote to you from the Manual of Seamanship, Volume 2, from immediately after the First World War, which obviously gives more typical peacetime routine. But if you were in port, say in Scapa, you might be following this drill as well. So it says, this is page 45 of the Admiralty Manual of Seamanship, Volume 2. As a general rule, the custom is on weekdays, Saturdays excepted, to complete the cleaning of the ship by the time for sounding off divisions, since after that divisional drills, training classes, etc. take place. A good routine should therefore aim at using the ship's company to the best advantage during this time. The hands, as a rule, fall in at 0600, Saturdays 15 minutes earlier, Sundays 15 minutes later. Some ships aim at cleaning all decks at the same time, others commence with the upper decks and then go on to the mess decks and flats. The time of daylight, weather conditions, and the number of liberty men must be considered. Most ships go to breakfast at about 0730. Consequently, the custom is to clean the upper deck and go to quarters, clean guns before breakfast. The term upper deck in a modern ship, so far as cleaning is concerned, generally includes bridges, boat deck, superstructures, etc., and in some cases the secondary batteries. Hence, the time allowed for cleaning the upper deck varies in different ships. An average time is from 50 minutes to an hour, Saturdays excepted. This leaves time for cleaning guns and upper deck bright work before breakfast, though libertymen may be away. 30 minutes is usually allowed for the former, and the latter can be completed in 15 minutes if carefully organised. Formerly, most ships cleaned the mess decks and flats before breakfast. Now, these are usually cleaned after breakfast. This is recommended since it has many advantages, i.e. the watch below, the watch previously on shore who should clean mess decks, etc., are now on board. The cleaning and washing goes on during the breakfast hour, and is not done on a deck which has just been cleaned. Mess tables and stools are therefore dry. In most ships, the ship's company dinners are now prepared by the ship's cook's ratings, and when these latter are not available, it must be done by the cooks of the messes, usually in the breakfast hour. And in any case, unless a central scullery is fitted, the mess deck used during breakfast has to be washed up and cleaned. All this assists to dirty the mess. Time is therefore saved by cleaning the mess deck after breakfast, and it is invariably the custom on Saturdays. Another point to be considered is the alteration of time of relieving watchkeepers due to the general messing system. See General Messing section. After divisions, assuming the ship to be cleaned, some form of activity exercise is carried out, then both watches are told off. Training classes will average about 60, all told on a battleship. Divisional drills, control and torpedo parties, etc. take the remainder, and thus few hands are available for parts of the ship. After dinner, similar instructional work is carried out until the secure is sounded at 1540. In a fleet, there is the fact that various fleet working parties, patrols, special parties of various sorts are constantly required, still further reducing the number of hands available after detailing instructional classes. Furthermore, the peace complement is not so large as the war complement, and a certain percentage are always on the sick list. A weekly routine of drills is usually contained in the fleet or station orders. Sunday should be kept as far as possible for a day of rest. The custom is Mondays, fleet, squadron or ship drill, Tuesdays, air bedding, etc., Wednesdays, land seamen or drill on board, Thursdays, land marines, Fridays, action stations, and Saturdays, clean ship and air night clothing. Captain's rounds are usually carried out on Thursdays, followed by seeing requestmen. Sea routine in war. Since more men will have kept night watch, the time of hands falling in is usually later, about 06:25. It is advisable to go to quarters to clean guns at once and overhaul the whole armament before cleaning ship. Breakfast at 0700, clean ship commencing at 0745. So hopefully that gives a vague indication of what will be going on. And finally, a tugboat named Bugtote asks, I recently have watched Greyhound again, and there occurred some questions. So I'm going to go through the questions in sort of quick-fire mode and answer them as they come. Firstly, the stores for depth charges aboard the protagonist Fletcher class seem to be quite limited to me. Although the movie certainly does not show every depth charge volley, they run very short of them roughly halfway through the journey, with fuel also running low. So that's actually quite accurate, because if you look at the surviving destroyer escorts, corvettes, frigates, etc., you'll notice that a significant part of their stern is set aside for depth charges, depth charge rails, depth charge launchers, and of course Hedgehogs, etc. Now, if you go aboard the Fletcher class destroyers that have survived, which of course Greyhound is representative of, and particularly if you go aboard, well, you can't go aboard now because she's in Drydock, but when she comes back out Drydock, USS Kidd, which is the ship that they were filming on, well, as you can see from this shot, the stern is rather heavily occupied by guns, so there is a much more limited space for the storage of depth charges. And therefore, a fleet destroyer, while it will carry a reasonable number of depth charges, and obviously in wartime they'd carry a few more here and there, physically cannot carry as many depth charges as a dedicated escort, which just has that much more surface area on its stern for this purpose. Next, the time of the movie is set in February 42, not long after the US had joined the war, so I was wondering, hadn't there been some procedure for underway replenishment for the escorts in that time, or even at all during the war? Theoretically, yes, you could refuel escorts, but the main problem was, where were you going to refuel and resupply them from? Because they weren't generally sending full resupply ships loaded with fuel and ammunition and depth charges with the convoys. You loaded up the escorts at the beginning, and they should in theory have the fuel to go all the way across, and they certainly should have the ammunition, because they just couldn't afford to be sticking resupply ships for the escorts on every single convoy. And you actually see that with Captain Walker in the series that I did on him. At one point, when one of his ships is actually running low on depth charges, he just goes over to one of the other escorts who has more depth charges, and they end up using the ship's boats to ferry fresh depth charges back and forth. Next, they have a rescue ship accompanying the convoy. Was this commonplace in that time or in the entire war? Rescue ships were fairly quickly developed at the beginning of the war, and where at all possible, they did include them on convoys. Obviously, they couldn't include them on all of them because there were a limited number of them. But yes, the idea of a dedicated ship that had an expanded medical facility, plenty of heated rooms and nets and so forth for the specific recovery of crews from other sunken vessels was pretty common in World War II, and certainly in mid-42, a lot of convoys would have had a rescue vessel of some description. Usually, for obvious reasons, the rescue vessel tended to sit roughly in the middle of the convoy's columns and towards the back. Additional question, the rescue ship appeared to be blacked out the entire time so as not to give away the convoy's position. Did the Germans take care not to sink a rescue ship, given that it had a big red cross painted on it, given to the similarity to the sinking of the Wilhelm Gustloff? So, in theory, if you had Red Cross protection indicated on your ship, you shouldn't be sunk, but there were a number of ships that were marked with Red Crosses that were sunk. Some deliberately, some arguably deliberately, some definitely accidental. And then, of course, there were also lots of ships that weren't sailing with a socking great Red Cross painted on them, that had a lot of people on board and not really much else, usually prisoner of war transports or evacuation transports. And, well, there wasn't really much of a way for a submarine to tell if they just see a big ship sailing along. Well, is this full of cargo? Is this full of troops? Is this full of prisoners of war? Is this full of civilians? Who knows? Torpedoes away. And occasionally it turns out it's full of civilians or prisoners from your own side. And then you also have the question of whether or not a rescue ship technically actually qualifies for Red Cross protection, because assuming that it's not armed, it is taking part in humanitarian missions, but obviously it's also connected directly with rescuing people who are in the middle of supplying wartime supplies to your opponent and or potentially sunken escorts, which could technically be interpreted as it taking part in the war effort. That's one for the lawyers to work on. Another question, when Greyhound engages a surface U-boat at very close range with its 5-inch gun, the accuracy isn't bad, but I'd have expected it to be much better. The captain ordered all mounts to open up under local control. Why? And how difficult was it to hit a U-boat at, let's say, 1,000 to 1,500 yards? So local control basically means everyone fires as best they think and as quickly as they can, as opposed to under direct control where there may be delays, waiting for all the 5-inch guns to be ready. But also the fire control systems normally obviously work either optically or on radar. And if you're trying to aim down at a submarine at very close range, you may just be better bore sighting, or if you're using 40 mils or 20 mils, just following your tracer rounds and walking them onto the sub. That might actually be a considerably quicker thing. So that's why local control is ordered. And even at 1,000 to 1,500 yards, a U-boat is still a pretty small target. And especially if you're operating under local control, bearing in mind your ship is maneuvering and bobbing up and down, and you're essentially trying to bore sight on, as I said, a relatively small target. So you could probably get shots pretty close, but even if you're perfectly aimed, the second or so between someone ordering the gun to fire and the gun actually firing, well, the ship might bob, roll or weave just enough to throw a shot off. Then, Greyhound was hit by a torpedo at so sharp an angle the torpedo basically ricochets off the hull with apparently no hull damage and the torpedo going off on its merry way. Is this possible, and did that really happen? Well, obviously, that particular film is, the Greyhound is fictional, so that particular incident didn't happen. But torpedoes ricocheting if they hit a very steep angle could happen. It's still a multi-ton thing heading at medium highway speeds towards a ship. So, especially against a destroyer, you wouldn't have no hull damage. You would have a dent of some description. But yes, you could get a torpedo to glance off at extreme angles. Partly because, well, it's, multi-ton cylinder moving at high speeds. If it hits at a very off angle, it's very possible it could break up from the horizontal forces. But also you've got to account for what kind of detonator is it using. If it's using a contact detonator, then that is going to require a fairly significant deceleration force to trigger it for obvious safety reasons. But if you are striking at an extreme angle such that the torpedo is still retaining a reasonable amount of its forward velocity, the deceleration may not be enough and may take place over a long enough time such that it doesn't actually trigger the detonator. Now, of course, some detonators are much more sensitive than others, so that kind of thing could happen with some torpedoes at some angles, but other torpedoes might detonate anyway. And then final part of his question, have I actually watched Greyhound, and if so, what did you like? I've watched bits of it. I haven't managed to watch the whole thing all the way through yet, simply because I've been really busy doing other things. But broadly, I do like it. It's certainly one of the better World War II related films to have come out in recent years. But at some point, I do need to actually watch the whole thing all the way through in one sitting. And that, at a total combined runtime of just over 6.5 hours, brings us to the end of this dry dock. Thank you very much, everyone who's stuck it out this far. And, I hope to see you again in another fractionally shorter video in the near future.